Tonight, we're diving into the part the books close the door on, the long, unglamorous years that came after the war was won, the 19 quiet years between a broken castle at dawn and a railway platform full of steam. Settle in, let your shoulders soften, and let the room around you grow dim and warm. There is nothing here to carry, and nothing here to fear, only a slow, steady voice tracing what became of everyone once the battle was over. If these long, gentle stories are the ones that finally get you under, a soft subscribe keeps them coming, night after night, and that is the only thing I will ask of you before we begin. Over the next 20 chapters we will follow, without haste, the funerals and the trials, the rebuilding of the castle, and the slow mending of a whole wounded world, the marriages and the children, and the long, patient work of ordinary days. You do not need to remember any of it. Let it move through you like a slow tide, and let it carry you softly down toward sleep. And so the morning came, as mornings always do, even to a castle that had spent the whole long night breaking. The last curse had already fallen. In the gray hush before full daylight, Lord Voldemort lay dead upon the flagstones of the great hall, small and shrunken and strangely ordinary now, that the thing which had driven him for so many years was gone, and the boy who had faced him stood quietly in the middle of a great, murmuring crowd, scarcely able to believe that any morning could arrive at all. The enchanted ceiling above them, which had shown lightning and green fire through the worst of the fighting, softened now into the pale, milky blue of true dawn, and the light that came down through the shattered windows fell gently over the living and the dead alike, asking nothing of either. For a little while, the hall was full of a strange, weightless joy, the kind that comes only after great fear, when people who have survived reach out to touch one another simply to be sure that they are real. Strangers embraced strangers. Boundaries that had stood for 1,000 years quietly dissolved, and the 4 longhouse tables no longer meant anything at all, so that Gryffindor sat with Slytherin, and Hufflepuff leaned against Ravenclaw, and no one thought to notice or to mind. Somewhere a first tentative cheer had risen and then faded, because the room could not hold celebration and grief in the same breath for long, and it was grief, in the end, that settled over everything like a soft gray blanket as the numbers of the night began to make themselves known. For the dead had been carried in from the grounds and from the corridors and laid in a long row down the center of the hall, and there were 50 of them, 50 who would not see this morning, and their families knelt beside them in the pale light. The Weasleys were gathered close around one of their own, around Fred, whose face still seemed to hold the last shape of laughter, and George knelt over the brother who had been the mirror of his whole life, and Molly and Arthur and Ginny and Bill and Charlie and Percy stood or sat among them, holding one another, saying very little, because there is a kind of loss for which there are no words and never will be. Percy, who had been so long estranged, who had come back only in the final hours, would not leave his brother's side. Nearby lay Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks, the young husband and the young wife, side by side in death as they had so briefly been in life, and somewhere far from that hall, a baby named Teddy slept in his grandmother's arms, not yet a month old, not yet knowing that he had become an orphan in the night. And there, too, was Colin Creevey, small for his age, who had crept back into the castle when he ought to have been safely away, whose camera would take no more pictures of a world he had loved too eagerly to leave. Through all of this, the boy moved as though underwater, and though 100 hands reached for him and 100 voices wished to thank him, he found that he wanted none of it, that what he wanted more than anything in the whole wide waking world was quiet and darkness and sleep. And so, with his two oldest friends close beside him, with Ron on one side and Hermione on the other, he slipped away from the crowded hall almost without being seen, drawing over the three of them the old silvery cloak that had hidden him so many times before. They stopped only once in a quiet corner where a house elf brought them food, for Creature had come up from the kitchens with the others of his kind, and the boy ate a little and felt some small warmth return to him, though his thoughts stayed heavy and far away. Then the three of them climbed, slowly and stiffly, up through a castle they hardly recognized, past staircases half fallen and walls scorched black, past suits of armor lying broken on the stones, up and up until they came at last to the stone gargoyle that guarded the headmaster's study, which sprang aside for them, though no password was given, as if the castle itself understood. The spiral stair carried them gently upward, and there, in the round quiet room at the top, the portraits of all the old headmasters and headmistresses waited, and every one of them rose to their feet in their frames and applauded, softly and without end, so that the boy stood before them with tears standing in his eyes. And behind the great desk hung a newer portrait, the painted likeness of the old headmaster with the long silver beard and the half-moon glasses, Albus Dumbledore, who looked down upon the boy he had guided for so long, with a pride too deep and too tender for painted eyes to fully hold. There, in the growing light of that first morning, 3 small objects lay upon the desk, and the boy considered them with a weariness that was older than his years. There was a wand of elderwood, pale and knobbled, the most powerful wand that had ever been made, which had answered to him now through a long chain of chances he had never sought. There was, in his memory, a small black stone lost somewhere beneath the trees of the forbidden forest, dropped as he walked to what he believed would be his death, a stone he had no wish to find again. And there was the cloak, soft and old and faithful, that had been passed down through his family for longer than anyone could remember. And the boy thought, in the slow and simple way that great tiredness allows, that he had held all 3 of the fabled hollows together, and that he did not want to be their master, and that the wisest thing he could do was to give the most dangerous of them up. So he took his own wand first, the wand of holly and phoenix feather that had chosen him in a dusty shop when he was only 11, the wand that had been snapped and broken in the wild flight of that terrible year, and he laid its 2 halves gently together and touched them with the elder wand, and the broken wood knitted whole again, warm and alive in his hand as it had always been. And then, having made his choice, he decided that the elder wand would go back to the tomb from which it had been taken, back to rest with the old headmaster who had wielded it wisely, so that if he himself should one day die a quiet and natural death, its terrible power might at last be broken forever and trouble the world no more. The stone he would leave lost among the roots and the leaves. The cloak alone he would keep, for it had only ever hidden and never harmed. And when all of that was settled, when the great weight of the war and the wand and the choosing had been set down at last, the boy found that there was nothing left in him but the plain and human longing to lie down and sleep. He said his soft goodnights to the painted headmaster, who gave him leave with the gentlest of gestures, and he went back down through the waking castle with his friends, and the 3 of them climbed the familiar tower to a familiar round room, where the 4 poster beds stood, waiting under their faded red hangings just as they always had. And there, at long last, with the morning sun climbing gold over the mountains and a whole broken world still to be mended somewhere far below. The boy who had won the war lay down and closed his eyes and slept, and for a little while asked nothing of anyone, and no one asked anything of him. Up next in Chapter 2, 50 Laid in a Row and a Castle in Ruins, we'll follow those long, quiet days of mourning that came after the sleeping, the 50 who were carried to their rest one by one, and the slow, patient reckoning of just how much of the ancient castle had fallen in the night, and all that it would take to raise it up again. When the last curse had spent itself, and the great serpent lay unmoving upon the flagstones, the castle did not burst into the sort of triumph the songs would later imagine. Instead, a long, weary hush came down over Hogwarts, the kind of quiet that rises not from peace exactly, but from exhaustion gone so deep that even joy must wait its turn. The morning after the battle unfolded slowly, the way mornings always do when too much has happened in the dark, and in the widening gray light, the survivors turned to the oldest and gentlest labor there is, the careful gathering in of their dead. There was no hurry in it, and there could not have been, for grief has its own slow pace, and the whole ruined school seemed to breathe in time with it. They carried them into the great hall, and they laid them in the middle of that vast room where 4 long house tables had stood for 1,000 years, and they laid them in a single long row, some 50 of them, side by side beneath the enchanted ceiling. That ceiling, indifferent and beautiful, showed the first soft flush of a new day, a wash of rose and pale gold spreading over the sleepers below, as though the sky itself had come indoors to keep watch. The 4 tables were gone now, pushed away or broken, and with them had gone the old divisions of the houses, so that those who still lived sat mingled together on the floor and against the walls, Gryffindor beside Slytherin, Hufflepuff beside Ravenclaw, too tired and too changed to remember why they had ever sat apart. Among the fallen lay Fred Weasley, the elder of the 2 laughing twins, and around him his family had gathered in a close and stricken ring. His mother knelt beside him, with her face gone still. His father bent over them both, and George, who had shared a face and a heartbeat and every joke of his life with his brother, sat in a silence so complete that it seemed a kind of wound in itself. Percy, who had come home to them in the last hours and had been at Fred's side when the wall burst, would not leave now, and Ginny and Bill and Fleur and Charlie drew close about them so that the whole family made one grieving shape in the dawn light. Not far off lay Remus Lupin and Nymphadora Tonks, stretched out near to one another, pale and peaceful and terribly young, their faces smoothed of every worry they had ever carried. Somewhere beyond the castle, in a small house tended by a grandmother, their infant son Teddy slept through the hour that made him an orphan, not yet 1 month old, and the world he woke into would be one that had never known his mother's changing hair or his father's tired, kindly smile. There were others in that long row whose names the living would carry for the rest of their days. There was Colin Creevey, only 16, too young by the rules to have fought at all, who had crept back into the castle through the passage in the dark because he could not bear to stand aside, and who had been carried in small and light by those who found him. There were students and teachers and grown witches and wizards who had come from every corner of the country when the call went out, and there were faces that no one present could name, strangers who had answered the summons of the coins and the patronuses, and had given everything for a place many of them had never seen. 50 lay together, and the number would be spoken quietly for years afterward, 50 who had held the line through the longest night so that morning could come at all. At the far end of the hall, upon a raised platform, the wounded were tended, and there Madame Pomfrey moved among them as she had moved among scraped knees and broken broomsticks for a lifetime, her hands steady, her voice low, doing the small, ceaseless work of mending flesh that magic can knit but never quite heal without time. In one corner the centaur Firenze lay recovering, gashed along his flank, patient as the trees he came from, and through the smashed remains of a great window, the giant Grop peered in at the wreckage of the room with a slow, uncomprehending sorrow. The house elves had come up from the kitchens far below, creature among them, and they slipped between the mourners with cups and blankets and quiet care, part of this house as surely as its stones, and the stones themselves told the story of what had passed there. The castle was in ruins, and everywhere the eye fell it found the marks of the siege. Great holes had been torn in the outer walls, so that the cold morning air moved freely through corridors that had been sealed for centuries. The marble staircase had lost whole steps and banisters, and stood chipped and gapped like a smile with teeth knocked out. Suits of armor that Professor McGonagall had woken and sent marching to the castle's defense lay, scattered and broken across the flagstones. Their empty helmets rolled into corners, and the stone statues that had answered the same summons stood cracked or shattered where they had fallen. There were scorch marks up the pillars and long dark stains across the floors, and in the courtyards outside lay rubble and the fallen of the other side, and the great bodies of giants, and the drifting silence of a fight gone still. The whomping willow drooped over the grounds, the greenhouses stood with their glass blown out, and beyond it all the lake lay flat and gray and calm, holding the growing light. There was one body that did not lie among the 50, and by the wish of those who had survived it, had been carried away into a small chamber off the great hall, apart from the fallen, so that no one grieving in that long row need ever look upon the face of the wizard who had brought them there. Voldemort lay alone in death as he had truly lived, and the door was closed upon him. And the living turned their backs and gave their attention wholly to their own. Into the exhausted order of that morning came Kingsley Shacklebolt, deep-voiced and steady, moving through the hall with the calm of a man who has decided that someone must begin, and so it may as well be him. He would be named Minister for Magic before the day was old, a minister nobody had schemed for and everybody trusted, and even now, before any title, he had quietly begun the endless list of things that must be done, the messages sent, the families found, the hurt carried to help. And somewhere in the midst of all of it, unnoticed under an old and silvery cloak, 3 friends slipped from the hall together, too weary for the crowd and its questions. Climbing at last through the wounded castle toward a spiral stair and a quiet office where a portrait of an old headmaster waited, and where the smallest and most important choices about what came next would soon be made in a hush all their own. But those choices, and the strange long reckoning that followed the war, would wait for daylight to strengthen. First the dead would be honored and given back to the earth, and first the living would have to answer the hardest question of a hard-won peace, which was what to do now with all those who had served the wrong side, some out of terror, some out of hunger, and some out of a coldness that no mercy could quite reach. Up next in Chapter 3, The Trials and Who Walked Free, we'll follow the slow gathering of the accused before the Wizengamot, the ones who were shown mercy and the ones who were not, and the surprising few whom Harry himself chose to speak for, softly, in the calmer months to come. When the last of the 50 had been laid in the ground, and the earth had been smoothed flat over them, and the wildflowers had begun their slow return to the disturbed soil, the world that remained turned its tired face toward a harder and quieter kind of work. The dead had been mourned, as fully as the living could manage, and now the living had to decide what would be done with all those who had walked on the other side, all those who had served the darkness and survived it. There would be no more curses flung across the great hall, no more running through the dark, but there would be reckoning, and reckoning is its own slow and heavy thing, and it settled over the wizarding world like the gray light of a long, mild afternoon. At the center of it all stood a calm and steady man named Kingsley Shacklebolt, tall and unhurried, with a deep voice that never rose to a shout. In the very hour after the battle, he had been asked to take the office of Minister for Magic on a temporary footing, to steer the wounded ministry through its first raw days, and before long, the wizarding community would vote him into that seat in earnest, choosing him not for ambition, but for the plain fairness that seemed to live in him. Kingsley wanted no vengeance. He had watched too much cruelty done in the name of order, and he was determined that the justice which followed the war would not become a second, slower kind of terror. He set about cleaning the ministry from the inside, pulling out the rotten and the corrupt, and he made one gentle, enormous decision very early. He would no longer keep the Dementors as guardians of the prison. Those cold and hooded things, which fed on hope and left despair, were quietly removed from their long watch over Azkaban, so that even the guilty who were sent there would not be drained hollow in the dark, for sent there many of them were. Across the country the Aurors gathered up the Death Eaters who had not fallen in the castle, the ones who had fled the grounds as the sky lightened, the ones found hiding in cellars and country houses and behind false names. One by one they were brought before the Wizengamot, that ancient court of plum-robed elders, to answer for the years of murder and torture and terror they had helped to make. And here the old memory of the First War lay heavy on everyone in the room. After Voldemort had first fallen, so many years before, a great number of his followers had escaped all punishment by claiming they had acted only under the Imperious Curse, that bewitchment which bends a person entirely to another's will, and by that easy lie they had walked free to gather again in the shadows. This time, the court meant to be more careful. This time, each claim of a cursed and unwilling heart would be weighed slowly and tested, and not simply believed because it was convenient. Yet the strange truth of that curse was that sometimes it was real. There were those who had genuinely been ridden like puppets, and for them the trials became not a condemnation, but a release. Pious Thickness, who had sat in the minister's own chair while Voldemort ruled the country through him, was found to have been placed under the Imperious Curse by the Death Eaters themselves, his will taken from him at the height of their power, and so the man who had signed the cruel decrees was judged to be as much a victim as an author of them. And there was gentle, foolish Stan Shunpike, the young conductor of the night bus, who had been swept up and enchanted and sent to fight against his own good nature during the wild flight of the 7 Harrys through the summer sky. When the enchantment was understood, he too was freed, and in time he climbed back aboard his lurching purple bus and called out its stops once more, as though the whole nightmare had been a fever that had finally broken. There was, as well, a great unwinding of a particular cruelty. During the dark year, the ministry had run something it called the Muggle-Born Registration Commission, a machine of paperwork and fear that had dragged witches and wizards of Muggle parentage before a panel to be questioned, accused, and imprisoned for the supposed crime of their own blood. Now that whole apparatus was taken apart. The men and women who had been locked away or driven into hiding were found and brought home. Families were reunited, and the long lists of names, gathered up to be used as weapons, were burned or sealed away so that they could never wound anyone again. Among those quietly restored to their ordinary lives were people like the Cattermoles, an ordinary family very nearly destroyed by a stamped and heartless decree, now free to sit again at their own kitchen table. And there was one face that the whole wizarding world remembered with a particular chill. The round, sweet, poisonous face of Dolores Umbridge, who had presided over that commission with a little cough and a fondness for pink. She had done her cruelty with a smile and a doily, and she had believed to the end that she was only tidying the world. Now she was arrested and brought before the court and tried for what she had truly done, the torment of the innocent under the false color of the law. She was convicted, and she was sent to Azkaban, where even without the Dementors, the plain gray walls would hold her for a very long time, and the sweetness she had worn like perfume would find no purchase at all. Not everyone who had stood on the wrong side, though, was made to pay in the same coin. In one of the quieter mercies of those months, Harry Potter himself came forward to speak. The Malfoy family, who had served Voldemort and sheltered him in their very home, stood in danger of the prison, and Harry chose to give evidence on behalf of Draco and of Narcissa. He remembered how Narcissa, kneeling over him in the Forbidden Forest, had looked into his living eyes and told a lie to the Dark Lord himself, saying that he was dead, and how that single act of a mother's fierce love had carried him back into the fight and helped, in the end, to end the war. He remembered, too, that Draco, for all his fear and his cruelty, had faltered at the last, unable to become the murderer that had been asked of him. And so Harry spoke plainly for them, and the family that had bowed to darkness was spared the cold cells, left free but diminished, their proud name gone gray with shame, to make what they could of a chastened and quieter life. There was, at the last, a different sort of clearing of names, one that no court could grant, for it belonged to the dead. As the truth of the war was slowly told and retold, the loyalty of Severus Snape, hidden for a lifetime behind a mask of spite, came at last into the daylight, and the man whom so many had believed a traitor was understood for what he had truly been, the bravest kind of guardian, cleared not by any verdict, but by the simple telling of what he had done. And in that same soft light, the memory of others long wronged began to settle into peace, so that the reckoning, when it was finished, had punished less than it had healed. Up next in Chapter 4, Rebuilding Hogwarts Stone by Stone, we'll follow the slow return of the wounded castle to itself, the mending of its shattered towers, and the quiet hands that raised each fallen stone back into the light. While the courtrooms in London slowly emptied and the last of the verdicts settled like dust into the great gray books of magical law, another kind of mending was beginning far to the north, upon the old castle that stood above its lock. Hogwarts had kept its watch for 1,000 years and more, and in a single night it had been broken as it had never been broken before. When the smoke of the 2nd of May at last drifted away over the mountains, what remained was a wounded thing, beloved and battered, its towers split open to the pale morning sky, its bridges fallen into the ravine, its courtyards strewn with rubble and glass, and the fine white powder of shattered stone. The rebuilding of it would fill the whole of that long summer, and in a gentler, unhurried way it would go on for years beyond, for a castle is never truly finished, and this one now carried its scars the way an old tree carries the memory of a storm, quietly and without complaint. At the head of it all stood Minerva McGonagall, who had for so many years been deputy and steady second, and who now, without any fuss or ceremony, became headmistress of the school. She had defended those walls with her own wand on the night of the battle, waking the suits of armor and the great stone statues and sending them marching down the corridors to stand between the children and the dark. Now she turned that same firm, patient will to the slower labor of putting everything back. Under her direction, the broken masonry was gathered and sorted, and stone by stone, wall by wall, the castle was coaxed back toward what it had been. Phileas Flitwick, small and precise and wonderfully gifted at the charms of restoration, moved through the ruined halls, lifting fallen archways back into their curves and knitting cracked columns whole again. Pomona Sprout coaxed the trampled grounds and the shattered greenhouses back into green and growing order. Horace Slughorn rolled up his sleeves among the others, and Rubeus Hagrid, whose own small hut had been scorched in the fighting, hauled beams and stone with the strength of half a dozen men, weeping now and then, and never ashamed of it. They did not work alone. From the ministry, newly steadied under the calm hand of Kingsley Shacklebolt, came aid and craftsmen and gold. For the country understood, in those first raw weeks, that the castle was more than a school, that it was a kind of heart, and that a heart must be tended if the rest is to heal. The house elves of the kitchens, who had streamed up from the cellars during the battle with their carving knives held high, now streamed up again to sweep and scrub and set the long tables right. From the edge of the forbidden forest, the centaurs kept their distant watch, and Grop, Hagrid's enormous half-brother, lent his great clumsy hands to the shifting of stones no ordinary team could lift. And there came, too, in twos and threes across that summer, the ones who had studied there before, grown men and women now, returning to lay a hand on the old walls that had raised them, so that the work of rebuilding became a slow and steady procession of many hands, passing stones from one to the next as gently as one passes a sleeping child. There was much to mend. The great hall, where only weeks before the 50 fallen had lain in their long and silent row, had to be swept clean of soot and sorrow alike, its ceiling charmed once more to mirror the moving sky, its windows glazed anew, the marble staircase, worn smooth by 1,000 years of hurrying feet, had been cracked and scattered, and each shifting flight had to be settled back onto its landings. High on the walls of the astronomy tower, the stone was blackened and split. Deep within the castle, the room of requirement, which had held so many hidden and forgotten things, had been gutted by a cursed and hungry fire on the night of the battle, and it lay for a long while dark and emptied. Before it, too, in its own secret way, began quietly to knit itself back together for whoever might one day have need of it again. And down by the still gray water of the lake there was a wound of a different and sadder kind. The white marble tomb of Albus Dumbledore had been broken open in the depths of the war, its lid cast aside by cold and greedy hands reaching for the wand that lay within, and so the resting place of the greatest wizard of that age had been left cracked and open to the wind. Gently, and with great reverence, the tomb was sealed once more, the marble made smooth and whole. The old headmaster laid again to his long rest beside the water he had loved. Above, in the round tower office that was now McGonagall's own, the portraits of the past headmasters watched all of it with painted eyes, and Dumbledore himself, half asleep in his gilded frame, followed the mending with a small and knowing smile. In time, and by the quiet insistence of Harry Potter, who understood at last the whole long secret of the man, a new portrait would come to hang among them, the sharp, pale face of Severus Snape, the bravest man Harry had ever known, given back his place upon the wall he had never meant to abandon. Slowly, the smaller things returned to their proper order. The suits of armor clanked back to their plinths and stood still again. The moving staircases learned once more to swing on their old and mischievous whims. The ghosts drifted through the restored corridors as they always had, nearly headless Nick, and the fat friar, and the sorrowful Grey Lady, and even Peeves, who had pelted the invaders with Snargaluff pods during the fighting, returned to his cheerful nuisance among the mended chandeliers. The fat lady settled back into her frame at the foot of Gryffindor Tower, her canvas repaired, her song a little hoarse but glad. And in the headmistress's office, the old sorting hat, scorched black along one brim where dark flame had once been set upon it, waited patiently upon its shelf, singing softly to itself, ready to begin its ancient work again. So it was that on the 1st of September in the year 1998, only 4 months after the castle had nearly fallen, the Hogwarts Express steamed north once more, and the children came back to a school that stood whole against the evening sky. Some of them were small and new and frightened, seeing the towers and the torches for the very first time. Others were older, come back to finish the year that fear and cruelty had stolen from them the winter before, wishing to sit at last the examinations they had been denied. They filed into the great hall beneath the mended, star-strewn ceiling, and they were sorted, one by one, into the 4 old houses, and the food appeared upon the long, clean tables as it always had, and the candles floated, and the walls that had so nearly crumbled held firm and warm around them. There were empty places, and there were quiet tears, and there was, threading gently through all of it, a fragile and unmistakable peace. The castle had been broken, and the castle had been made whole, and it stood ready once more to keep its patient watch over the sleep of every child within its walls. Up next in Chapter 5, The Long Cleaning of the Ministry, we'll follow the quieter war that was waged not with wands, but with parchment and patience, through the shadowed corridors and dusty filing rooms of a government that had to sweep out, slowly and thoroughly, every last trace of the darkness that had crept into its heart. While the castle in the north was drawing itself upright again, stone by patient stone, a second and far quieter mending had already begun far to the south, deep beneath the busy streets of London, down in the long marble halls of the Ministry of Magic. It was a slower labor than the setting of stone, and a harder one to see with the eye. For the wounds of the ministry were not fallen towers or shattered glass, but something softer and more stubborn. The fear that had soaked into its offices during the long year of the shadow. The lists that had been kept in its drawers. The good people who had learned, for their own safety, to look away. And so, as the summer of that year settled warm and heavy over the whole tired country, the cleaning of the ministry began, not with one grand and shining gesture, but with 1,000 small and unglamorous ones, day following patient day. At the very center of it stood a tall and calm and deep-voiced man named Kingsley Shacklebolt. He was a former Auror who had once been trusted to guard the Muggle Prime Minister himself, and who had served in secret through all the dark years as a faithful member of the Order of the Phoenix, and in the raw and uncertain hours after the battle, with the old regime broken and its puppet minister cast down into ruin, it was to Kingsley that the wizarding world turned almost by instinct. He was named Minister for Magic on a temporary footing at first, a steady pair of hands to hold a frightened country while it found its feet, and he took up the great office in the same plain and unhurried way that he did everything else. There was no crowing in him and no hunger for the seat. He simply began, quietly, to work. And because he worked well, and because people trusted the deep and gentle weight of him, the temporary title was before long made permanent, and Kingsley Shacklebolt settled into the longest and best-loved ministry that magical Britain had known in living memory. His first promise was at once the simplest and the largest of them all, that the ministry would never again be a place where innocent people were hunted for the accident of their birth. The whole cruel machinery of terror that the enemy had built inside those very walls was taken carefully apart, piece by piece and law by law. The Muggle-born Registration Commission, that cold and prim invention which had summoned witches and wizards of ordinary parentage to be questioned and doubted and stripped of their wands, was dissolved entirely, its files unsealed, its summonses fed to the fire, its frightened victims sought out one by one and told, gently, that they were free at last to come home. In the great atrium far below, where the enemy had raised an ugly black statue of a witch and a wizard enthroned upon the crushed and huddled bodies of Muggles, that monstrous monument to cruelty did not outlast the season, for a thing built to make people feel small could not be suffered to stand in the very doorway of a mended world, and little by little the ordinary heartbeat of the place resumed around the workers, the enchanted golden lifts rattling up and down their shafts, the little violet paper memos fluttering along the corridors overhead like tame birds, the green flames flickering in the long rank of hearths as clerks and secretaries arrived each gray morning to a ministry that felt, for the first time in more than a year, like a safe and honest place to spend a working day. The clearing of the offices themselves was patient and careful and entirely without show. Kingsley had seen far too clearly what came of a ministry that began to punish by suspicion and by rumor, and he had not the least wish to raise a gentler tyranny upon the wreck of a cruel one, and so those who had served the shadow were not dragged out in a single furious morning to satisfy the anger of a wounded people. Their cases were sorted instead, slowly and fairly, and passed along in their proper order to the ancient Wizengamot for judgment. Some, like the honest officials who had bent to the imperious curse against their own will, were heard and believed, and quietly restored to their desks. Others, who had chosen the darkness with open and knowing eyes, were removed and made to answer for what they had done, and among them, in her own good time, went Dolores Umbridge, the small pink woman who had presided over the Registration Commission with such prim and simpering satisfaction, taken from her comfortable office at last and made to answer for her cruelties before the court, and thence sent to a cold cell in the fortress of Azkaban. As the rotten timbers were drawn out of the old structure, honest ones were set carefully in their place, and here the ministry began to fill again with faces that the war itself had proven true. Kingsley wished to have about him people who had refused, when it truly counted, to look away, and one by one they came to him. Arthur Weasley, who had spent his whole modest and overlooked career being quietly mocked for his tender fascination with Muggles and their plugs and their batteries, found of a sudden that this very fondness was the thing the new ministry prized above almost all others. And he went on with his patient work in a world that had at long last caught up to the goodness in him. His third son Percy came back also, humbled and forgiven. The young man who had once chosen ambition over his own family, and then, in the very heart of the final battle, had chosen his family back again. Percy returned not as a striver, clinging to the favor of his betters, but as a steady and honest official. And he rose in the years that followed upon plain merit rather than upon flattery, a small and private redemption played quietly out in memos and in meetings. The old Vizingamot itself, that plum-robed court and council which sat to make and to weigh the wizarding law, was steadied and cleansed in the same unhurried fashion, its long benches slowly filled once more with men and women who could be trusted to hold a single human life with proper care. Kingsley cast his net wider still, out toward the young ones who had fought so bravely in the smoking corridors of Hogwarts. Knowing that the Auror Office had been all but gutted, and that a healing country would need protectors it could wholly trust, he threw open its doors to Harry Potter, and to Ronald Weasley, and to Neville Longbottom, and offered them a place in that elite corps without the long years of examination that were usually asked. For what higher qualification could there ever be than a war already survived and won? That particular thread of Harry and Ron learning the slow craft of the Auror would unspool gently in its own good time. And there were older wrongs unwound in these same quiet months. For Kingsley would no longer suffer the Ministry to lean its justice upon the Dementors, those hooded and hungering things that had fed upon every warm memory a prisoner owned, and had served the enemy so gladly at the last. And he set about the long and careful work of taking them off the gray walls of Azkaban and finding for that cold prison a kinder kind of keeping. Yet beneath every sacking and every restoration there ran a deeper current still. For Kingsley Shacklebolt did not mean only to make the Ministry safe again. He meant, in his slow and steady way, to make it fairer than it had ever once been, kinder to the very people it had spent long centuries half forgetting, to the goblins with their long memory of broken promises, to the centaurs in their forests, to the house elves in their kitchens, to all the gentle and outcast folk the old order had held forever at arm's length. It was not the work of a single season, and some of it met with grumbling from those who had loved the comfortable old shape of things. But the direction had turned, the way one feels a long, hard winter finally begin to soften, and everyone within those marble walls could feel the change of the air, and a great part of that gentler labor fell to a fierce and tender-hearted young witch newly come among the offices, Hermione Granger, who cared far less for the chasing of dark wizards than for the quiet and patient injustices that lay woven, unnoticed and unquestioned, into the very letter of the wizarding law. Up next in Chapter 6, pulling the blood laws from the books, we'll follow that patient unwriting of every cruel decree of blood and of birth that the long dark years had left behind, the quiet restoring of names and rights to all those the old order had branded unworthy, and watch a scarred and healing world begin, statute by gentle statute, to make its own law kind again. The cleaning of the Ministry, once its corridors had been emptied of the men who had poisoned them, moved next into the quiet rooms where that poison had been written down. For it was one thing to lift a cruel official out of his chair, and quite another to lift the cruelty he had left behind in ink. Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had stepped from the last of the fighting into the office of Minister for Magic almost before the dust of the broken castle had settled, understood this more clearly than most, and so among the earliest and gentlest labors of his new government was the patient opening of the law books of the year that had just passed, and the slow reading, page by page and clause by clause, of everything that had been done in the name of magic and blood. It was not thrilling work, and it made no noise, and it healed nothing that could be seen from the outside. Yet it was among the most important work of all, for a law left standing on a shelf can go on wounding people long after the hand that wrote it has been led away. In the months when Lord Voldemort had ruled through a frightened puppet, when pious Thickness sat as minister, with another man's will moving behind his eyes, a whole architecture of hatred had been raised in the space of a single year, and it had been raised in the calm official language of statute and form and stamped parchment. At the heart of it stood the Muggle-born Registration Commission, a body invented to answer a question that no honest person had ever asked. The monstrous and impossible question of how a witch or wizard born to Muggle parents had come to hold magic at all. The lie the commission told, printed and bound and handed out through the ministry, was that such magic must have been stolen, taken somehow from a true witch or wizard by force or by theft, and that those who carried it were therefore criminals who had never committed a crime. A pamphlet had been produced to carry that lie into every home, its very title naming the Muggle born as a danger to a peaceful society, and above the atrium, a great dark statue had been raised in place of the old fountain. A witch and a wizard seated in cold triumph upon carved and crushed Muggle forms, and beneath them the two blunt words that summed the whole regime: that magic is might. Under that statue and under that lie, ordinary people had been summoned, one after another, to sit before Dolores Umbridge and her commission, and to account for blood they could not change and had no reason to be ashamed of. Their wands were taken from them, snapped away from their fingers as though a wand were a thing a person could steal rather than a thing that chooses its owner, and many were sent without true trial to the cold cells of Azkaban, guarded still in those days by the Dementors, who fed upon whatever small warmth the prisoners had managed to keep. Families had gone into hiding. Children had missed their letters. A whole thread of the wizarding world had been pulled loose and left to fray. All of it done properly. All of it stamped and filed. All of it perfectly legal within a system that had gone entirely rotten at its root. So when Kingsley set his people to the law books, this was the first and heaviest knot they came to, and they did not hurry to cut it. For a thing done in haste can leave a ragged edge. Instead, they worked through it strand by strand. The Muggle-born Registration Commission was dissolved, struck from the rolls of the ministry as though it had been a fever the body was finally sweating out, and every judgment it had ever handed down was declared void from the very beginning, as though the ink had never dried. The long register of names, that cruel ledger of people marked out only for the accident of their birth, was gathered up and unmade. The doors of the holding cells were opened. Those who had been sent to Azkaban for the invented crime of stealing their own magic were brought back into the light, blinking and thin and often greatly changed, and their wands, where the wands could still be found, were returned to hands that had been aching for them, and where a wand had been broken beyond mending, a new one was sought, so that no witch or wizard freed by the new government would walk back into the world defenseless. There were homes to be found again for those who had lost them, and letters of apology, plain and formal, sent out under the new minister's seal to families who had been broken apart. And there was the slow business of helping people believe once more that a summons from the ministry might mean help rather than harm. None of it could give back the frightened months that had been taken, and no one pretended that it could. Yet the returning of a person's own wand to their own hand was a small warm mercy after so long a cold, and it was repeated, quietly and without ceremony, again and again through that first healing year. Kingsley did more than empty the cells, for he had promised himself, in the first gray hours of his ministry, that the instruments of terror would not simply be handed to gentler masters, but set down altogether. And so, in one of the quiet and lasting reforms of those early years, the Dementors were withdrawn from their long watch over Azkaban, drawn back from the guarding of prisoners. For a government that had just torn down a lie about stolen magic could not in honesty keep creatures whose only craft was the stealing of hope. The dark statue in the atrium came down as well, hauled from its place of false honor, and the cold slogan beneath it was carried off with the rubble of the old regime, and the great hall of the ministry, for a while, stood plain and unadorned, which was its own kind of truth after so much loud and gilded cruelty. Yet even as the newest and crudest of the blood laws were pulled from the books, there came a slower and more delicate understanding, which was that not every unfair thing in the wizarding world had been written in the year of Voldemort's rule. Some of it was far older, folded so deeply into the ordinary running of things that no single villain could be blamed for it, and no single repeal could sweep it away. There were quiet biases in the phrasing of long-standing statutes, small preferences given to the old families, the lingering shadow of ideas that had been fashionable in darker generations. The notion of the pure of blood and the blood trader and the sacred count of the oldest houses. These were not undone in a single winter. They were the work of years, and much of that work would fall, in time, to a young woman who had fought in the castle and who now turned, with the same fierce patience she had once brought to a library, toward the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, where Hermione Granger would become a steady and progressive voice, reading the old laws as closely as she had once read her lessons and lifting out, one careful clause at a time, the injustices that had hidden themselves in plain and legal sight. For the truth that the new government came slowly to hold was that a law can be repealed in an afternoon, but the belief beneath it is a longer and gentler undoing, and beliefs are not struck from books. They are worn away like stone beneath water. Over the passing of years and the raising of children who never learned to fear a neighbor's blood, and so the pulling of the blood laws from the books was both a single bright act and a long quiet labor that would outlast Kingsley's ministry and reach far into the calmer world to come, the world of weddings and schoolrooms and steam upon a platform, a world where a witch born to Muggle parents might one day rise to the very highest office in the land, and no old statute would so much as murmur against her. Up next in Chapter 7, Harry, Ron, and the Auror Office, Wheel. While the lawmakers bent over their long parchments in the quiet marble halls below London, patiently unwriting the cruel decrees of blood and birth, another and far older question was moving softly through the mending ministry, gentler than the debates in the courtrooms, yet no less needful for the peace that everyone was trying to build. For laws upon a page, however just and however carefully worded, cannot keep themselves. A statute cannot walk out into the wide sleeping country in the dead of night. It cannot answer the wizard who will not lay down his wand, nor find the ones who slipped away in the smoke of that last gray morning and went on dreaming of the old darkness in hidden corners of the world. Somebody of flesh and courage must do those things, and so, in the calm months after the fall of Voldemort, the wizarding world turned its slow attention to the small and famous corner of the ministry, where the catchers of dark wizards had always labored, the office of the Aurors, and to the two young men who would come to shape it for a whole long generation. The Aurors had always been the most respected and the most demanding branch of magical law enforcement, a small and hardy band of witches and wizards trained to hunt the very darkest sorcerers alive, and the road into their ranks had never once been an easy one to walk. In the ordinary way of things, a hopeful young Auror had first to earn the highest marks the castle could give, at least 5 of the punishing examinations, known as the nastily exhausting wizarding tests, and none of them below the grade of exceeds expectations, in the hardest subjects the school taught, in defense against the dark arts, and in transfiguration, in potions, and in charms. And after all of that came 3 long years of further training, of stealth and of tracking, of concealment and of disguise, of learning to see through a false face, to shrug off a jinx, and to keep a steady hand when everything around them was fear. It was a career that swallowed years before it gave anything back at all, and it turned away far more hopefuls than it ever gathered in, and the boy who had won the war had never once sat the examinations that were meant to open its heavy door. He did not need to. For the new Minister for Magic, Kingsley Shacklebolt, who had himself been an Auror through the worst of the Shadow years, understood a thing that no examination in the world could ever measure. He knew that Harry Potter and Ronald Weasley had already done, in a single wild and terrible year, far more than any training program could ever hope to teach. They had tracked and destroyed the hidden fragments of a torn and monstrous soul, moving unseen across a country that wanted them dead. They had broken into the deepest vaults beneath Gringotts, and into the very heart of a ministry ruled by their enemies. They had met dark magic of a kind that most seasoned Aurors encountered only once or twice in a long career, and they had met it again and again through a whole year of running, and they had lived. And so Kingsley, in one of the first quiet acts of his new office, set the ordinary rules gently aside and invited the two of them to join the Aurors at once, without the examinations and without the years of waiting, simply because there was nothing left that he could think to teach them which they had not already learned in fire. Harry accepted, for it was the only work he had ever truly wanted, and Ron accepted beside him. And so the two friends who had grown up shoulder to shoulder, who had shared a compartment on a scarlet train when they were only 11 years old, walked now into the Ministry of Magic, not as frightened boys, but as colleagues, side by side, with the whole of the great department opening before them. It was a strange and tender thing to witness. The corridors that had lately been ruled by terror, where a monstrous black statue had once shown Muggle-borns crushed beneath the weight of the pure, were being scrubbed and swept clean of all of that, and into them walked the very young men who had helped to bring the old cruelty down, come now to keep the long watch themselves. The work that waited for them was patient and unglamorous, and it filled the years that followed without much noise. For the great battle had ended, and yet not every servant of the Dark Lord had fallen in the Great Hall, or been gathered up for trial. Some had fled in the confusion of that last gray morning, slipping away across the countryside and over the cold sea, into hidden houses at home, and into foreign shores abroad, and it fell to the Aurors to seek them out, one by one, and to bring them quietly back to justice. So Harry and Ron went out together into that long clearing away, following the last of the Death Eaters through the seasons, unknotting the small plots of those who still whispered of the old power, making a whole country safe again, not in a single bright stroke, but in 1,000 careful and forgotten ones. A labor with very little glory in it, and a very great deal of worth. And as they worked, they helped, almost without meaning to remake the very office that they had joined. For the Auror department had not always been a gentle keeper of the law. In the fearful years of the First War against Voldemort, under the hard and iron hand of Bartemius Crouch the Elder, the Aurors had been granted a terrible license, permitted to answer dark magic with dark magic, to turn the unforgivable curses upon their quarry, to kill rather than to capture, and to treat a mere suspicion as though it were already a proven guilt. That harshness had worked its own quiet ruin upon the soul of the wizarding world, and Kingsley was resolved that it should never creep back. Under his steady leadership, and with Harry and Ron among the small band who carried the new spirit into every case, the department was remade patiently from the inside outward, turned away from vengeance, and toward a cleaner and more lawful courage, so that the Aurors became once again what they had always been meant to be: protectors rather than avengers. A shield held gently over the innocent rather than a blade swung in fear. Ron stayed at Harry's side through that work for a couple of good years, and he was far better at it than he ever quite allowed himself to believe. Steady and brave and quick, carrying the long loyalty that had already carried him through everything else. But there was a grief in the Weasley family that never entirely closed. The empty chair where Fred had always sat, and there was a shop in Diagon Alley with only one twin left to run it, growing quietly threadbare under the weight of so much sorrow. And so, when the first and hardest years of the clearing away had passed, Ron chose to lay down his Auror's robes and go to his brother George to help him keep the doors of Weasley's Wizarding Wheezes open and bright, and to bring his own warm good sense to the running of it. Under the two of them together, the shop flourished as it never had before and became the roaring success that it remains to this day, and Ron never once regretted the choosing, and never for a single moment lost the deep and easy closeness he had always shared with the friend he left behind at the Ministry. Harry stayed. The work suited something settled and quiet in him, the same steadiness that had always made him reach not for power, but for the plain protection of other people, and he gave himself to it fully through the long ordinary years. He rose slowly through the ranks of the office he had helped to heal, learning its patient craft season upon season, until at last, in the year 2007, when he was still a young man of only 26, he was made the head of the whole Auror Office, the youngest ever to hold that high and sober post, and there he remained, keeping faithful guard over the peace that he had bled to win. An ordinary father who went on ordinary mornings to an extraordinary desk, so that the orphan boy who had never once wanted fame or greatness grew slowly into a man who wanted only to keep the world a little safer than he had found it. And quietly, year upon patient year, he did. Up next in Chapter 8, Hermione's long climb to Minister for Magic, we'll follow the cleverest witch of her whole age down a different and quieter corridor of that same ministry, and watch how a girl born to two Muggle dentists rose, one honest step at a time, from the department that spoke for the forgotten to the very highest seat in all the wizarding world. While Harry and Ron were settling into the long rhythm of the Auror Office, learning to read a dark corridor and to trust the quiet between alarms, Hermione Granger walked a different road out of the war, and it was, in its own gentle way, the slowest and the steepest of the three. She had spent the better part of a year living in a tent with the fate of the world folded into a small beaded bag, and when at last the smoke thinned over the broken towers of the castle, she did not hurry toward the first open door, where her two dearest friends were welcomed straight into the ranks of the Aurors, taken on without examinations by a grateful new administration that needed steady hands. Hermione turned instead toward the one thing the war had quietly stolen from her before she was ready to let it go, and that was her unfinished schooling. She was the only one of the three who chose to go back to Hogwarts in the year the castle was still healing, to sit once more in mended classrooms beneath a ceiling only lately repaired, to complete her 7th year in full, and to take her NEWTs the way she had always meant to, with every subject attempted and nothing at all left half done. There was something deeply like her in that decision, and something soothing in it too, for while others measured their recovery in victories and in medals, Hermione measured hers in the quiet turning of pages, in a return to order, in the simple restoration of a thing left incomplete. When the examinations were behind her at last, marked as high as anyone had ever marked them, She carried that thoroughness with her through the tall doors of the Ministry of Magic and into the first of the two great departments that would hold the long work of her life. She began her career in the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, and to those who had known her since her 4th year, this came as no surprise at all, for it was here that the small, stubborn cause of her girlhood finally found its true and lasting shape. Years before, as a girl of 14, she had knitted lopsided woolen hats and left them scattered about the Gryffindor common room in the hope of freeing house elves who had never asked to be freed, and she had founded a society with a name that made her friends smile, the Society for the Promotion of Elfish Welfare. What had once been the earnest campaign of a single determined student now became patient, real, and lawful work, carried out clause by clause and season by season within the machinery of the ministry itself. She labeled it no longer with badges, but with statutes, and she gave the whole of her care to improving the daily lives of house elves and of the many other creatures who had lived for centuries at the very edges of wizarding law, unseen and unthanked. She worked to lift their protections, to soften the old cruelties written into custom, and to grant a measure of dignity to beings who had been counted for far too long as property rather than as persons. It was slow work and unglamorous, the sort of labor that wins no cheers, and it suited her exactly, for she had never wanted applause so much as she had wanted things to be truly and permanently better. In time she moved from the care of creatures to the harder ground of the law itself, crossing into the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, the largest and weightiest department in all the ministry, and there she began the long, steady climb that would carry her at last to its very head. She rose through it not by chance and not by name, but by the plain force of her thoroughness, by knowing the statutes better than those who had written them, by reading every clause twice and remembering all of it. As she rose, she set her mind to the last poisoned remnants of the years of terror, and she gave herself to the patient task of stripping the old pro-pureblood laws out of the books, the cruel and prejudiced measures that Voldemort's brief regime had pressed upon a frightened people. One by one, she pulled them free, the statutes of blood status and the registries of shame, so that no witch or wizard would ever again be tried or hunted for the accident of their ancestry. In this she completed the very cleaning that a whole generation had begun, and she did it with the same quiet resolve she had once poured into a pile of woolen hats. Through all these unhurried years her heart had a home to return to when the long days at the ministry were done, for she had married Ron Weasley, the friend who had stood beside her through every dark mile of the war. Together they made a warm and ordinary life in the calm that peace had bought so dearly, and in time 2 children came to them, a daughter named Rose and a son named Hugo, born into a world their parents had helped to mend. Hermione carried her family and her career side by side without ever letting either fall, and there was a soothing steadiness in the way she moved between the great chamber of the law and the small bright rooms of home, between the drafting of statutes and the tucking in of children, giving to each the whole of her attention. Above her, through the first of those healing years, sat Kingsley Shacklebolt, the calm, deep-voiced Auror who had steadied the whole country in its most fragile hour and who had been made minister for magic when the fighting ended. Under his long and even-handed rule, the wizarding world found the peace it needed to grow whole again, and it was within that peace, and upon the foundation of his patient reforms, that Hermione's own ascent quietly continued. She became, in the fullness of time, the head of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, one of the most powerful posts the ministry could offer, and from that high seat she watched over the justice of a nation that had so recently forgotten how to be just. Yet even that was not the summit of her long climb, for the years kept turning, and the trust the wizarding world placed in her kept deepening, until at last the greatest office of all came to rest upon her shoulders, and Hermione Granger was made Minister for Magic. She had come a very long way indeed, from a bushy-haired girl raised by two Muggle dentists, a child once dismissed by the proud and the cruel for the plainness of her blood, to the single most important witch in Britain, the guardian of its laws and the keeper of its peace. And she wore that vast authority as she had worn everything else in her life, without vanity and without unfairness, ruling not by fear, but by fairness, remembering always the woolen hats and the house elves, and the long apprenticeship of her care. Under her the old prejudices found no shelter, and the memory of the war was honored not with monuments alone, but with the quiet, daily justice she had spent her whole life learning how to build. In the story of the 19 years that followed the last battle, hers was perhaps the truest measure of how far the world had traveled, that the child once scorned for her birth now sat at the very head of the wizarding realm, and no one thought it strange, and everyone thought it right. And so, with Hermione settled into the great work of governing gently, we turn now toward another of the friends who had survived, one whose road was lit less by ambition than by loss, and by the long, brave labor of learning to laugh again. Up next in Chapter 9, George and the Shop with One Twin in It will follow the surviving Weasley twin as he keeps the lights burning above a joke shop that was built, from its very first day, for two. While Hermione bent the whole of her care toward the mending of laws, another of the friends who had come through the fire was learning a lesson far harder than any statute, which was how to go on being one where there had always been two. George Weasley had been born a twin on the 1st of April in the year 1978, and for the whole of his life, until the last battle, he had never once been wholly alone, for he had come into the world with Fred at his side, and had grown up mirrored, matched, and doubled, the two of them so alike in face and in mischief that even their own mother could sometimes tell them apart only by guessing. They had shared a bedroom and a birthday, a sense of humor, and a single unbroken thought, finishing each other's sentences and each other's schemes. And when in time they built a thing of their own to leave behind them in the world, they built it, from its very first day, for two. That thing was a joke shop, and it stood at number 93 Diagon Alley, and it had begun as a dream whispered between two boys who cared very little for examinations and a very great deal for laughter. They had funded it, in the end, with a gift, for Harry had pressed upon them the 1,000 galleons of his Tree Wizard winnings, unwilling to keep for himself the prize money of a tournament that had cost so much, and he had asked in return only that they go and make the world laugh. With that gold in their pockets, the twins had made their exit from Hogwarts in a manner that no student who saw it ever forgot, for in the grim year when Dolores Umbridge ruled the castle with her small, cruel decrees, Fred and George had risen up on their broomsticks in the middle of an examination, loosed a magnificent portable swamp and a storm of fireworks upon the corridors, and flown off together into the open sky, free at last to build their shop. Weasley's Wizarding Wheezes opened its doors in the summer of that same year, a bright and riotous blaze of color in a Diagon Alley that was growing darker by the month. And while the shops around it boarded up their windows in fear of the rising terror, the twins' shop stayed lit and loud and full, one of the few places left where a frightened people could still buy a reason to smile. It made them, to everyone's quiet astonishment, remarkably prosperous, for laughter turned out to be a thing the world would always want most sharply when it had least cause for it. And through all of it, the two of them worked as one, side by side behind the counter, so completely a pair that it was hard to imagine the shop, or indeed the very idea of a Weasley twin, meaning anything but both of them at once. The first great wound came before the last battle ever did. On the night the Order flew Harry out of Privet Drive, under cover of many decoys, in the wild-running fight across the summer sky that came to be called the Battle of the Seven Potters, a curse meant for another struck George instead and tore one ear clean from the side of his head. He came down grievously hurt and pale as candle wax, and yet when he woke among his frightened family, the very first thing he reached for was a joke, turning the raw wound into a pun, telling Fred with a weak and stubborn grin that he felt saint-like now, holy, that he was holy where before he had been whole. It was a poor joke and a brave one, and Fred laughed, and in the memory of what came after it would grow almost unbearably tender, for it was proof that even maimed and bleeding the two of them reached first for laughter, and reached for it together. Then came the 2nd of May, and the wall and the blast that no joke could soften. In the thick of the fighting for Hogwarts, in a corridor full of dust and falling stone, Fred Weasley was laughing at something Percy had said, laughing with his whole heart in the last instant of his life, when an explosion tore through the castle wall and took him in a single moment, so that he died as he had lived, mid-laugh, with the joke still warm upon his face. He was 20 years old, and one half of a matched and inseparable pair, and when the smoke cleared, George knelt beside a face that was his own face, and understood that the mirror had gone dark forever. There is no gentle way to tell of what that loss did to George, and so it must simply be told softly. He did not, in the long years that followed, ever entirely mend, for a twin is not merely a brother, but a second self, and to lose Fred was to lose a piece of his own reflection. The ordinary things turned strange and painful. The 1st of April, once the merriest day of his year, now carried a shadow through the middle of its brightness. To catch his own face in a looking-glass was to see the brother who was gone. The old shared jokes, the sentences built to be finished by another mouth, hung unfinished in the quiet air. And for a long while it seemed possible that the lights above the shop that had been built for two might simply, gently, go out. But they did not go out. Slowly, and with a courage that made no speeches and asked for no medals, George came to understand that the surest way to keep his brother alive in the world was to keep alive the thing the two of them had made together, and so he lifted the shutters once more over number 93 and carried the shop on. He did not carry it alone for very long, for his youngest brother came to stand at his side. Ron Weasley, after a couple of years of hunting dark wizards in the Auror Office, hung up that perilous work and came instead to help run Weasley's Wizarding Wheezes, and under the two of them the shop grew from a bright surviving ember into an enormous and roaring success, an emporium of harmless mischief, famous the whole length of the country, so that Fred's name lived on above a till that never stopped ringing. And in time, gently, George's heart learned how to be happy once more. He married Angelina Johnson, a Gryffindor of his own years, a fine chaser who had once captained their old Quidditch team. And there was a soft and knowing poignancy in the match that those who remembered would carry quietly within them, for Angelina was the very girl whom Fred had taken to the Yule Ball in the winter of the Triwizard year. It was as though the two lives, the one that was lost and the one that lived on, had been woven a little nearer to each other by her presence. George and Angelina made a warm home together and had 2 children, and when the first of them, a boy, was born, George gave him the only name he could ever truly have given him, and called him Fred, so that the sound of it would go on being spoken with love in a happy house for many years to come. A daughter followed after, whom they named Roxanne, and the 4 of them made a family full of the very laughter that George had once feared he had lost for good. So the shop that had been built for 2 went on being kept by 1, and yet not truly by 1 at all, for Fred was in every whoopee cushion and every trick wand upon its shelves, in the very color of its paint and the very sound of its name, kept alive by a brother who had chosen laughter as the deepest and most loyal form of grief. George Weasley never quite became the man he might have been had the wall not fallen, and everyone who loved him knew it. And yet he became something quietly magnificent all the same. A man who lost his other half and answered the loss not with silence, but with joy, keeping the lights burning above Diagon Alley night after night in memory of the boy who had died laughing. And while George kept the world laughing from behind his bright and crowded counter, other survivors of the same long war were finding their peace in gentler and stiller ways, tending greenhouses and following invisible creatures far from any crowd. Up next in Chapter 10, Neville, Luna, and the Quiet Lives will follow 2 of the war's softest-spoken heroes into the calm and rooted years that carried each of them, at their own unhurried pace, toward homes and callings all their own. From the bright and busy shopfront in Diagon Alley, where George Weasley kept alive the laughter that had once belonged to 2, the long story of the 19 years turns now toward a gentler quarter still, toward 2 of the war's most unlikely heroes, whose lives after the fighting were lived not in the glare of high office, but in the soft and steady light of ordinary things. For not every road out of the last battle led toward the ministry or the Auror Office, and not every survivor measured their peace in rank or in reward. Some of the bravest among them simply went home to the work they loved, and grew quietly into the people that the war had shown them they already were, and among all of these there were none dearer or more soothing to remember than Neville Longbottom and Luna Lovegood. Neville had come a very long way from the round-faced, forgetful boy who had once lost his toad upon the Hogwarts Express and stood trembling at the back of every classroom. In the last and darkest year, while Harry and Ron and Hermione were hunting Horcruxes across the length of the country, it had been Neville who stayed behind within the walls of the occupied school, and it had been Neville who led what remained of Dumbledore's army through the cruel reign of the Carrows, hiding the hunted, heartening the frightened, and drawing the punishments upon himself so that younger children might be spared them. And it had been Neville, at the very end of everything, who drew the sword of Gryffindor from the depths of the Sorting Hat and struck the head from the great serpent Nagini, destroying the last of the Dark Lord's Horcruxes and clearing the final path toward victory. He had begun his school days as the least likely of heroes, and he had finished the war as one of its truest. For a season after the fighting he wore, like his friends, the robes of an Auror, taking his part in the steady labor of gathering up the last of the frightened and the dangerous. Yet the calling that ran deepest in him had never been the calling of the wand, and in time he set that work gently aside and turned back toward the one thing that had always made him whole, which was the quiet and patient tending of growing things. Neville had loved herbology since he was a boy, and had found in the warm, damp air of the greenhouses a peace he could find in no other place, and so it seemed only right and gentle when at last he returned to Hogwarts, no longer as a pupil now, but as its professor of herbology, teaching a new generation to coax life from soil and seed. Under Professor Longbottom, the greenhouses flourished, and the children who came after him loved him well, and in the years that followed he was counted by Harry himself among the finest and kindest of all the teachers. A hero grown so mild that the pupils he taught could scarcely believe the stories told of him. His heart, too, found a quiet home. Neville married Hannah Abbott, a gentle Hufflepuff who had stood beside him in Dumbledore's army in their school days, and their life together was as warm and unshowy as the man himself. Hannah trained first as a healer, and then, to the surprise of very nearly everyone who knew her, she became the landlady of the Leaky Cauldron, that old and crooked inn where the world of the Muggles and the world of magic lean quietly against one another. The two of them made their home in the small rooms above the pub, and there Neville lived within easy reach both of his beloved school and of the busy little tavern his wife kept. A man wholly at peace now in the very heart of the world he had once been far too shy to speak up in. Yet his gentleness carried always a thread of sorrow, born without a word of complaint. His father and mother, Frank and Alice Longbottom, had been fine Aurors in the First War against Voldemort, and they had been tortured into madness by Bellatrix Lestrange and her companions until their minds were lost past all mending. They lived on still in the long white ward of St. Mungo's Hospital, not knowing their own son, and through all the years of his quiet triumph, Neville went on visiting them faithfully, sitting at their bedsides, receiving the small offered gifts of a mother who no longer knew his name. His grandmother Augusta, who had raised him with a stern and worried love and had long feared he would never match his parents, lived to see him honored across the whole of Britain, and she was proud of him at last, prouder than she had words for, of the grandson who had turned out braver than ever she had dared to hope. And where Neville's road ran down into soil and stone, the road of Luna Lovegood ran out across the whole wide turning world. Luna had always been the strangest and the most serene of Harry's friends, the dreamy girl with the radish earrings and the upside-down magazine, who believed in creatures that no one else could see and spoke aloud the plain truths that others were too careful to say. The war had not dimmed her. If anything, it had shown the steel in her, for she had been seized and imprisoned in the cellar of Malfoy Manor, and she had come through even that with her odd bright kindness entirely whole. Upon the ceiling of her bedroom she had once painted the faces of the friends she loved the best, Harry and Ron and Hermione, Ginny and Neville, and bound them each about with a fine gold chain that spelled the single word friends, so that even when she was alone, she was never truly by herself. When the peace came at last, Luna did not settle behind a desk or a shop counter. She became instead a wizarding naturalist, a seeker and a finder of magical creatures, and she gave her days to traveling the far corners of the earth in search of the rare and the hidden, and the not yet believed in. Some of the beasts she hunted for, such as the crumple-horned snorkack her father had always sworn was real, she never did find at all, and this troubled her not in the least, for the searching itself was joy enough for her. Others, strange and wonderful and wholly new, she was the very first to observe and to name, and in time she grew famous in her gentle and unhurried way as one of the great naturalists of the age. Upon those long journeys she found her own quiet happiness as well, for she married a fellow seeker of creatures named Rolf Scamander, the grandson of the celebrated Newton Scamander, who had written the great book of fantastic beasts long years before. Together, the two of them roamed the wide world in search of its living marvels, two dreamers exactly matched, and in the fullness of time there came to them two sons. twin boys, whom they named Lorcan and Lysander, born a little later than the other children of that generation, and raised among wonders that their friends could only imagine. Luna never lost the dreaming lightness that had made her so easy to mock and so impossible ever to forget, and she carried it undimmed into her motherhood and her middle years. A woman who had looked upon war and loss and captivity and had chosen, always and gently, to go on believing in the goodness and the strangeness of the world. So it was that two of the bravest hearts in the whole of the long tale asked for no thrones and no titles at all, but only for greenhouses and creatures, for a pub above a cobbled street, and a tent beneath foreign stars. And in asking for so very little, they found a peace as deep as any in the wizarding world. Their quiet lives were the surest sign of all that the war was truly ended, that the young could grow now toward the things that they loved rather than the things that they feared. And as these gentle friends settled at last into their chosen corners of the mending world, the time drew near for the whole scattered family of survivors to gather again, no longer in grief now, but in gladness, beneath flowers and soft candlelight. Up next, in Chapter 11, The Weddings and the New Peace, we'll follow the joining of hearts and houses as the friends who had bled together learned, one by one, to marry and to build, and to fill the calm and healing years with the sound of new beginnings. In the same soft years that carried Neville into his warm and steaming greenhouses and Luna out toward the far gentle edges of the world, a quieter miracle was unfolding across the whole of the wizarding country, one that asked for no wands and no courage and no cleverness at all, but only the willingness of frightened people to believe once more in the morning. For in the long calm that followed the last battle, the surest sign that the terror had truly ended was not written in any statute, nor carved upon any stone, but sung instead in the small and shining ordinariness of weddings, one after another, season upon season, as the survivors turned at last from the heavy business of mourning toward the sweeter and slower business of beginning again. There is nothing so peaceful as a people who have decided to fall in love, and in those healing years the wizarding world fell in love a great many times over. The very first of the family's weddings had come before the peace, and it remembered the fear. Bill Weasley and Fleur Delacour had married at the Burrow in the August before the fall, beneath a great white marquee raised in the orchard, and their joy had been cut short that same evening when a silver messenger drifted down among the dancers to tell them that the ministry had fallen and that the darkness was coming. Yet that marriage held. It had been sealed under a gathering storm, and it survived the storm entire, so that when the calm returned, Bill and Fleur stood already as living proof that love begun in dread could ripen into something wholly safe. In the quiet years afterward there came to them a daughter, and then a second daughter, and then a son, Victoire and Dominique and Louis, 3 bright children raised in the sound of the sea near the cottage called Shell Cottage, where once the desperate and the hunted had been hidden and healed. Then came the wedding that all of Britain had waited for, without quite daring to say so, for Harry Potter, who had carried the whole weight of the war upon his young shoulders, married Ginny Weasley, the fierce and laughing girl who had loved him quietly since she was a child at the Burrow. Theirs was a homecoming as much as a union, for in marrying Ginny, Harry married at last into the great red-haired family that had adopted him in all but name long before. The family whose kitchen had been the first warm place he had ever truly belonged. The orphan boy who had grown beneath a staircase, unwanted and unkissed, now stood in the heart of a household that wanted him beyond measure. In the fullness of the peaceful years, 3 children were born to them, and each name was a small act of remembrance. James Sirius for the father and the godfather he had lost, Albus Severus for the 2 headmasters whose bravery had shielded him, and Lily Luna, soft and bright, for his mother and for the dreaming friend who had never once deserted him. Not far from them, and on the very same gentle road, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger were married too, the 2 friends who had bickered and blushed and grown up side by side through every dark mile of the hunt. Theirs had been the slowest courtship of all, 7 long years of unspoken feeling, and when at last it came to rest in marriage, it had the settled sureness of a thing that had always been meant. They built a warm and ordinary life together, and in time a daughter named Rose and a son named Hugo came into it, born into a world their mother and father had helped to mend clause by clause and battle by battle. There was a soothing rightness in it, that the boy who had left and returned, and the girl who had never stopped believing, should end their long story not in glory, but in the quiet contentment of a shared home. The weddings did not stop there, for the whole of the Weasley household seemed to bloom at once in the returning warmth. George, the surviving twin, who had learned so painfully to laugh again above his crowded shop, married Angelina Johnson, the steady Gryffindor chaser who had known his brother and knew his grief, and to them were born a daughter named Roxanne and a son whom George called Fred, so that the beloved name might live on in a child's bright laughter rather than only in silence. Percy, too, the proud and rule-bound brother who had wandered away from his family and come stumbling home at the darkest hour, found a gentle happiness at last with a witch named Audrey, and together they raised 2 small daughters, Molly and Lucy, the elder of them named for the mother whose door had always stayed open. One by one the sons and daughters of that house were wed, and the orchard at the Burrow saw marquee after marquee raised in the good summer air. At the center of it all stood Molly and Arthur Weasley, grown gray now and gentler still, watching their children marry and their grandchildren arrive in a slow and steady tide. Their long kitchen table, which had stretched itself for so many years to feed whoever wandered in, stretched further yet to hold the new husbands and wives and the small ones climbing into laps. There was one chair that stayed forever empty, and everyone knew whose it was, and no one pretended otherwise, for Fred was remembered at every gathering with a fondness that had learned to sit peacefully beside the ache. Yet the house was fuller than it had ever been, and its fullness was the plainest answer the family could give to the years of loss, that where death had tried to empty them, love had quietly filled them past the brim. All of this tenderness rested upon a foundation that few of the newlyweds paused to name, and that foundation was the new peace itself, held steady by the calm, deep-voiced Minister for Magic, Kingsley Shacklebolt. Under his patient and even-handed rule, the wizarding world was given the one thing it had lacked for so long, which was the simple safety in which ordinary happiness could grow. He drove the last corruption from the ministry and forbade his Aurors ever again to use the unforgivable curses upon their prisoners, and he saw to it that the soul-eating Dementors, those cold guardians who had once drifted about the walls of Azkaban, were stripped forever of their post, so that no fortress of the law would ever again be watched over by despair. It was upon that cleansed and quiet ground, swept clear of the old fear, that a whole generation was free to court and to marry and to begin. And of all the children born into that returning light, one had come first, and had come with a name that said everything. Bill and Fleur's eldest daughter had been born upon the 2nd day of May, upon the very anniversary of the great battle, and for that reason they had called her victoire, which is to say victory, so that each year the day the wizarding world remembered its dead would also be the day it sang for a child's birthday. In that single small girl, the war's ending and the peace's beginning were folded gently together. Grief and gladness laid side by side, and no one who held her could think the long sacrifice had been for nothing. She was the future, arrived exactly on the anniversary of the past, and she would grow, in time, into a story of her own. Up next in Chapter 12, Teddy Lupin, raised by many hands, will follow another child of that tender peace, the small blue-haired boy left orphaned by the very last of the fighting, and will see how a whole community of grieving, loving people gathered around him, so that no child of the war would ever have to grow up as lonely as Harry once had. Among all the households that the new peace had opened like windows after a long winter, there was one small child who seemed to belong to every one of them, and to no single one alone. A boy passed with the greatest tenderness from arm to arm across the whole of the mended world, and his name was Teddy Remus Lupin. He had come into being in the April before the last battle, born to Remus Lupin and to Nymphadora Tonks in the final, frightened spring of the war, when the two of them had married quietly and against every caution, and had made, in the very teeth of the darkness, one bright and hopeful thing. His father had carried the news of him to Shell Cottage in a rush of unlooked-for joy, arriving windblown and radiant to announce that a son had been born. And there, on that gray coast, Remus had asked Harry Potter to stand as the child's godfather, and Harry, young and astonished and glad, had answered that he would. It was a promise made in the last calm hour before the storm broke, and the storm did not spare the ones who had made it. Within a few short weeks, both of Teddy's parents went up to Hogwarts to fight in the battle that would end the war, and neither of them came down from the castle again. Remus and Tonks fell on the 2nd of May in the same long night, and their bodies were laid side by side among the 50 dead in the Great Hall, together in death as they had so briefly been in life, while their son slept on in his grandmother's house, far too small to know that the world had just been remade at the cost of his mother and his father both. He was orphaned before he could speak a single word, before he could walk a single step, before he could hold in his memory a single true picture of the two faces that had bent so lovingly above his cradle. Nor had the war taken only his parents, for it had already taken his grandfather. Ted Tonks, the kindly muggle born from whom the boy took his name, had been driven into hiding when the new regime began to hunt the wizard-born of muggle families, and he had been killed by snatchers while on the run, months before his grandson was born. And so, when the smoke at last cleared, the whole weight of that small life came to rest upon a single pair of aging hands. The hands of Andromeda Tonks, who in the space of one dreadful year had lost her husband, her daughter, and her son-in-law, and who now gathered up the very last of her family, a motherless, fatherless infant, and set herself to raise him alone. There was a strange and quiet poetry in the woman who took him in. Andromeda had been born a black, the middle of 3 sisters, and her 2 sisters were Bellatrix Lestrange and Narcissa Malfoy, so that the child cradled in her arms was bound by blood to the very family whose pride had done so much to darken the age. Long before, Andromeda had loved and married Ted Tonks, a Muggle-born, and for that unforgivable tenderness the House of Black had struck her name from its ancient tapestry and cast her out, and she had gone gladly, choosing warmth over purity and love over the cold approval of her kin. She wore her sister Bellatrix's very features, the same dark hair and the same heavy-lidded eyes, so that to look at her was almost to look upon the cruelest witch of the age, and yet everything behind that face was gentle, and the likeness only made her kindness the more remarkable. In her modest house, with a grief she never spoke of resting quietly beneath her care, she gave her grandson the steady love that her own sisters had long ago traded away. And she became the first and the most constant of the many hands that raised him. But she was not the only pair, for Harry Potter kept the promise he had made on that wind-blown shore, and he kept it not as a duty but as a joy. Deep in the Forbidden Forest, in the last dark walk before he gave himself up, Harry had seen his father's shade and his mother's, and Sirius, and Remus too. And Remus had told him softly that he was sorry to be leaving his son, but that he hoped one day the boy would understand that his father had died trying to build a world in which that child might live more happily. Harry carried those gentle words with him ever after, and he made of them a way of living. Teddy grew up half in his grandmother's house and half in the warm sprawl of the Potters' home, coming round to Harry and Ginny's table 4 evenings out of every week, so woven into their household that he was less a visitor than an elder brother to the children who came after him, a familiar and beloved figure at every birthday, every Christmas, and every ordinary quiet supper. And there were more hands still, for the Weasleys folded him in as they folded in everyone, and the burrow and its long tangled garden held a place for him as surely as it held a place for any grandchild of Molly and Arthur. He was raised, in truth, by a whole clan, by a grandmother and a godfather, and a great scattered family of aunts and uncles who were not his aunts and uncles at all, except in the only way that ever truly mattered. And out of so much shared and overlapping love there grew a bright and untroubled boy, easy in his laughter and sure of his welcome in every doorway he passed through. The war had meant to leave him with nothing, and instead, the peace had left him with more mothers and fathers than any single child could count. From his mother, he had inherited her rarest gift, for Teddy was a metamorphmagus, able to change his face and his hair at will, and though his father had carried through all his life the affliction of the werewolf, the boy bore no trace of that curse at all, and had only the harmless, playful magic of his mother's blood. To the delight of every small child who watched him, he could turn his hair a vivid turquoise or shift his nose into any comical shape that was asked of him. And in this he kept alive, without ever having truly known her, the very brightness that Tonks had once carried into the grim and anxious councils of the Order of the Phoenix. It was as though some small living piece of his mother had been given back to the world through him, and no one who loved her could look at the boy without feeling her near. So the years turned gently over him, and the orphan of the war became the eldest child of the peace. He went in his time to Hogwarts, where he grew into a fine and well-liked young man, and rose at the last to be head boy, and through all of it he remained the bridge between the age that had ended and the age that had begun, the living thread that tied the fallen to the newly born. And when 19 years had passed since the night his parents died, upon a smoke-wreathed platform beneath the great scarlet engine of the Hogwarts Express, the youngest generation caught him at last in a small and happy scandal, for James Potter came tearing through the crowd, bursting with the news that he had seen Teddy kissing Victoire, the eldest and loveliest daughter of Bill and Fleur Weasley. Harry only smiled at that, for Teddy was at their house so very nearly always that the difference between a godson and a true son had long since worn thin, and there stirred in Harry a quiet and hopeful wondering whether the boy he had helped to raise might one day, through this bright and gentle girl, become his family in name as well as in every way that already counted. And so the child who had been raised by many hands grew into a young man who belonged, at the last, wholly and joyfully, to the very world those hands had labored to save. Up next in Chapter 13, the children of a calmer world will turn to the sons and daughters born into that hard-won peace, the new generation of Potters and Weasleys and the friends who grew up beside them, and follow the small bright lives that came of age, knowing nothing at all of the terror their parents had once survived on their behalf. If Teddy Lupin had been the very first child of the new peace, the little boy with the ever-changing hair who had come into the world just as the last shadows were falling away, then he was only the beginning of a far greater and gentler procession. For in the long calm that followed the final battle, the survivors did what all weary people do when at last they are allowed to rest. They turned from war toward life, and one by one, and household by household, they began to fill the quiet world they had won with children. It was a slow and healing thing to watch, this arrival of a whole generation who would never once have to hide, who would grow up beneath a sky no longer darkened by any terror, who would learn the story of the darkness only from the soft telling of parents by the firelight, and never from the darkness itself. These were the children of a calmer world, and every single one of them, in the simple fact of arriving, was a kind of quiet answer to all the sorrow that had gone before, a small warm proof that the future the fighters had bled for had truly come, and had come to stay. Among the first of them was a bright little girl born to Bill Weasley and his French wife Fleur Delacour, the couple who had been married at the Burrow on the very eve of the darkness, and whose cottage by the sea had sheltered so many of those who were fleeing it. Their eldest daughter came into the world upon the 2nd of May, on the very turning of the year that marked the anniversary of the last battle, and for that reason, and for the joy of it, they gave her the name Victoire, which is the French word for victory, so that the day once heavy with the names of the fallen might carry ever after the name of a living child as well. After Victoire there came a second daughter, Dominique, and then a son, Louis, and the small family in the cottage above the shore grew warm and full, part French and part English, part Weasley and part Delacour, and wholly, gladly, of the peace. Harry Potter, meanwhile, had married the girl who had waited for him through all the dark years, Ginny Weasley, the youngest of the great red-haired family and the only daughter among its 7 children, a fierce and laughing witch who had loved him quietly since she was a small girl at the Burrow. Together they made their home, and together they raised 3 children of their own. And in the naming of those 3 Harry gathered up the whole of his heart, and all of his lost and living loves, and folded them tenderly into the names of the ones who would live on. Their eldest son he called James Sirius, after his own father, James, who had died to shield him when he was barely a year old, and after Sirius Black, the brave and reckless godfather who had been the nearest thing to a parent Harry had ever truly known. Their second son he named Albus Severus, and in that single small name he laid to rest the longest quarrel of his life. For he named the boy after the 2 headmasters of Hogwarts, after Albus Dumbledore, who had guided him through every peril, and after Severus Snape, the man Harry had once hated above almost all others, and had come, in the end, and too late, to understand as one of the bravest souls he had ever known. And their youngest, a daughter with her mother's red hair, he called Lily Luna, after his own mother, Lily, who had given her life to save his when he was too young to remember her face, and after Luna Lovegood, the strange and gentle friend who had never once left his side when leaving would have been so much easier. In another warm house not far away, Ron Weasley and Hermione Granger were raising 2 children of their own, born into the very same piece, a daughter named Rose and a son named Hugo, cousins to the Potter children, and bound to them by every tie of blood and of friendship. Rose had her mother's quickness of mind and her father's easy humor, and she was very nearly the same age as Albus Potter, so that the 2 of them grew up side by side, half cousins and half friends, waiting together through the slow, sweet seasons of their childhood for the day when they would be old enough at last to board the scarlet train and follow all the family that had gone before them into the ancient halls of Hogwarts. And around these 2 households there gathered the whole broad and boisterous clan of the next generation of Weasleys, for the great family that the war had wounded so deeply now spread wide again in the gentle sunshine of the years of peace. Percy Weasley, who had come home at the very last and stood beside his brothers in the final fight, married a woman named Audrey, and to them were born 2 daughters, Molly and Lucy. George Weasley, who carried through all his days the quiet ache of the twin he had lost, married Angelina Johnson, and he gave his firstborn son the name Fred, so that the name of the brother who had died laughing might be spoken warmly again in a house full of children and never be allowed to fall silent. And after Fred there came a daughter, Roxanne Sotherborough, that crooked and beloved house which had known such grief, filled once more at every holiday with the shouting and the tumbling and the laughter of small cousins. And Molly Weasley, the grandmother of them all, watched over the long crowded table with a heart that had been broken and was slowly, year upon year, being made whole again by the very sound of it. Nor was the peace granted only to those who had stood upon the winning side, for far away in the tall, cold rooms of Malfoy Manor, another child of the calmer world was growing quietly toward the light. Draco Malfoy, who had been a frightened boy pressed into the service of a cause he had come at last to loathe, had married a gentle witch named Astoria Greengrass, and the 2 of them, who had each seen quite enough of cruelty to wish none of it upon a child, raised a single son named Scorpius Hyperion Malfoy. They raised him softly, and they raised him kindly, and they taught him none of the old poison of blood and pride that had ruined so many Malfoys before him, so that the heir of the proudest pure-blood house in all of Britain grew up instead to be one of the sweetest-natured children of his whole generation, a shy and bookish boy who would one day cross the very oldest of the family divides to become the truest and dearest friend that a son of Harry Potter would ever have. So the calmer world filled slowly and steadily with its children, cousin beside cousin and friend beside friend, and the houses that had stood so long in fear now stood in ordinary happiness instead, warm with cooking and with holidays and with the small daily magic of family life. And in one of those houses, the tall dark old house at number 12 Grimmauld Place, where Harry and Ginny had made an early home in the first quiet years of their marriage, there moved among the family a small and ancient servant, a wrinkled old house elf who had once been so full of bitterness and spite, and who had been changed in the slow and patient way that nearly everything was changed across these years, by a single act of wholly unexpected kindness. His name was Creature, and his long story reached far back into the sorrows of an older and unhappier house, and it was, in the end, one of the very gentlest mendings of them all. Up next, in Chapter 14, Creature and the Mending of an Old Wrong, we'll follow the old house elf of Grimmauld Place back through his long years of grief, to the young master he once loved and lost, and to the single quiet kindness of Harry Potter that finally set a very old and painful wrong to rights. While the children of that calmer world were being rocked in their cradles and carried up quiet staircases to bed, There stood in one tall and narrow house in London an old and wrinkled servant who had lived through far darker households than these, and whose long story is perhaps the gentlest proof of how much the world had truly changed. His name was Creature, and he was a house elf of the most ancient and most noble House of Black. And to understand the mending of the old wrong that at last came to find him, one must first travel back along the whole bent and sorrowful length of his years. For many centuries, the house elves of the wizarding world had lived at the very edges of its law, bound to serve, passed from hand to hand like furniture or old silver, counted as property, and never once as persons. Creature had been born into that bondage and had known nothing else in all his life. He had served the House of Black in its proudest and its cruelest seasons, when the walls of number 12 Grimold Place were hung with the shrunken heads of the elves who had served before him, and when the portrait of a shrieking mistress taught him each day to love the very prejudices that despised him. He had loved his masters as he had been bred to love them, without question and without reward. And chief among all of them, in the deep and secret places of his small heart, he had loved a young son of that house named Regulus Arcturus Black. There came a day, in the darkest of the old years, when Regulus lent his elf to the Dark Lord for a single cruel purpose, and Lord Voldemort took Creature to a black lake in a hidden cave and used him there to test the poison that guarded a small golden locket. A locket that was in truth one of the torn and hidden fragments of his own soul. Creature was left in that cave to die, made to drink the burning potion, and then abandoned among the drowned and grasping dead of the water, and only the deep and particular magic of house elves carried him home alive. When Regulus at last understood what had been done to his servant, something in the proud young man broke open into goodness, and he returned to that cave himself, and drank the terrible potion himself, and pressed the true locket into Creature's hands with the order to destroy it, and then let the dead of the lake pull him gently under in the elf's place. So it was that Regulus Black perished unknown and unmourned, a boy who had turned against the Dark Lord long before anyone dreamed such a thing could be done, while Creature carried home a piece of Voldemort's soul that he could not destroy however hard and however long he tried, and the failure of it gnawed at him for years like a splinter lodged too deep ever to be reached. Then the house passed to Regulus's elder brother, to Sirius, who hated the gloom of his family home and everything that still lived within it, and who was cold and sharp with the old elf, and never once troubled to learn the grief that he carried. Creature, unloved and half-maddened by loneliness, gave what little loyalty remained in him to the cousins of the family who still honored the old cruelties, and in a moment of muddled and miserable malice, he helped to lead Sirius to his death in the Department of Mysteries. It was the lowest point of a long, low life, and when Sirius fell at last through the Whispering Veil, the house and the elf together passed by inheritance to a grieving godson, to Harry Potter, who wanted neither the one nor the other. For a long while there was nothing between the boy and the elf but coldness. Creature muttered his insults beneath his breath and polished the old prejudices as though they were the family silver, and Harry, sick at the very sight of the creature who had helped to kill his godfather, could scarcely bear to look at him. And this might well have been the whole of it, one more small cruelty handed quietly down the generations without any end. Had Harry not learned, in the last and hardest year of the war, the true and long-buried story of Regulus and the locket, and had he not, in the learning of it, finally looked upon the old elf and seen there not a servant at all, but a person who had been broken by a lifetime of being owned. That was the turning, and it was a small and quiet one, as the truest turnings so very often are. Harry did not simply free Creature, for freedom was not yet the thing the old elf longed for, but he did something that no master of that dark house had done in living memory. He gave him a gift. He placed into the elf's trembling hands a locket that had once belonged to Regulus himself, and he spoke to him with plain gratitude and with unexpected gentleness, and he asked for his help rather than commanding it. And Creature, who had not been thanked by a single soul in 100 long years, wept great and shaking tears into the folds of his filthy rag, and clutched the locket tight against his chest, and something long frozen within him began at last to thaw. What followed was a slow and soothing wonder to behold. The muttering stopped. The old drawing room of number 12 Grimmauld Place, which had lain for years beneath a gray shroud of dust and doxies, began once more to gleam beneath Creature's tireless polishing hands. He washed and pressed the small clean cloth he wore, and he set the black family locket about his neck like a medal of honor. And he cooked, for the first time in an age, out of love, and no longer out of duty, laying before the 3 weary travelers steaming bowls of French onion soup and golden steak and kidney pie and warm treacle tart, feeding them as though the feeding of them were a kind of quiet prayer. He had been given, at the very end of his long and thankless service, the one thing that had always been withheld from him, which was simple human kindness, and he returned it now 100-fold and more. And when the last battle came at length to Hogwarts, it was Creature who led the house elves of the castle up out of their warm kitchens and into the heart of the fight, an old and wrinkled elf brandishing a heavy cleaver above his head and calling out the name of Regulus Black, charging at the ankles of the Dark Lord's followers on behalf of a master who had died to defy them. The very elves that Hermione had once dreamed of freeing rose up that night of their own free will, not because any wizard had ordered them to fight, but because at last they had something they judged truly worth defending, and old Creature was there at the head of them all. In the long and healing peace that followed the victory, the wrong that had been done to Creature, and to all the countless creatures of his kind, was mended not by a single grand decree, but by 1,000 small daily kindnesses, and by the patient, unglamorous labor of the law. Hermione carried the cause of the house elves into the very heart of the ministry, lifting their old protections clause by careful clause, and Harry, who had himself grown up in a cupboard beneath a staircase, and knew in his own bones what it was to be treated as something less than a person, kept faith with the old elf to the very end of his days. So it was that on the night the war was finally won, worn out past all bearing and longing for nothing in the world but sleep, the last small and tender wish to cross Harry Potter's mind was the ordinary hope that Creature might bring him a sandwich. There is no truer measure of how very far that household had traveled, from the shrunken heads mounted upon its walls to a tired boy and his devoted elf at gentle ease together, than that one quiet and homely thought. Up next in Chapter 15, The Wand Returned to Its Grave, we'll follow the strange and peaceful fate of the most dangerous wand ever made, and the calm and deliberate choice by which Harry laid its long history of murder and mastery softly and forever to its rest. While the last of the household wrongs were being mended within the old dark house at number 12, Grimmauld Place, and a weary old elf was learning for the first time in his long life what it felt like to be thanked and not commanded, there remained one older and stranger matter still waiting to be quietly laid to rest, and it was not a person at all, nor a grievance, nor a law, but a wand. It had been in Harry Potter's keeping since the very last hour of the battle, this pale and knotted length of elder wood, marked along its shaft with small carvings like the rings of some ancient tree. And though it looked to any passing eye like the plainest and least remarkable sort of thing, it was in truth the most dangerous object in the whole of the wizarding world, and Harry had understood, from the very moment it came to him, that he could not keep it. The wand had gathered many names to itself across the long centuries, for it had been called the Death Stick and the Wand of Destiny, and the oldest of the old stories whispered that Death himself had given it to the eldest of 3 brothers on a lonely bridge at dusk. Though the wiser and quieter heads believed it had simply been made, ages ago, by a gifted and unlucky wizard of the Peverell line. Whatever its true beginning, the history that followed was written almost wholly in blood, for it was a wand that could never be owned in peace, but only ever won, its loyalty passing solely to the witch or wizard who defeated its former master. Down all the slow, dark years it had traveled from hand to hand by theft and by murder and by conquest, leaving behind it a long trail of the fallen, until it came at last into the possession of a wand-maker named Grigorovitch, and was stolen from him through a high window by a laughing young thief named Gellert Grindelwald. Grindelwald wielded that terrible wand through the darkest rise of his power, until in the year 1945 he was beaten in a legendary duel by the one man he had ever truly feared, and in his own strange way had once truly loved, Albus Dumbledore. For the whole of the long life that remained to him, Dumbledore held the most powerful wand ever made, and yet he wielded it for nothing but gentle purposes, teaching schoolchildren their charms and their transfigurations, guarding a castle full of the young, and asking of it no conquest at all. In his careful keeping, the old bloody habit of the wand was, for a little while, stilled, and it did quiet and kindly work, and it seemed almost to forget the red road it had walked to reach him. But mastery of such a thing is a subtle and dangerous secret, and it slipped away from Dumbledore in a manner that few living souls understood. High upon the astronomy tower, in the wand light of a terrible night, a frightened boy named Draco Malfoy disarmed the old headmaster before another hand struck him down, and in that single act of disarming, and not in the killing that followed, the allegiance of the Elder Wand passed quietly and unknowingly to Draco. Long months later, in the cold drawing room of Malfoy Manor, Harry Potter wrestled a wand from that same boy's grip and overpowered him, and so the deepest loyalty of the Elder Wood passed onward again to Harry, who had never once touched it. This was the small and hidden thread that undid the whole dark design of Voldemort, for when the two faced each other at the very end, the wand that Voldemort had robbed from Dumbledore's tomb would not turn its full strength against its own true master, and the curse he cast rebounded upon himself. And so, in the strange and ringing quiet that settled over the broken castle when all the fighting had finally stopped, Harry stood with 2 wands in his keeping. One was the Elder, humming faintly with its unwanted power. The other, held together only by its own splinters, was the treasured wand of holly and phoenix feather that had chosen him at the age of 11 in a dusty little shop in Diagon Alley, and that had been shattered months before during a desperate flight from Godric's Hollow. That broken wand, far more than any trophy of victory, was the thing his heart most wanted back. And so, before he did anything at all with the fearful power he now held, he laid the 2 side by side upon the desk and used the Elder Wand for one last, tender task. He touched the ruined holly to itself and mended it, and the wand that no other magic had been able to repair grew whole again, warm and faithful and good as new beneath his fingers. Then, with his oldest friend restored to him, Harry climbed with Ron and Hermione up to the round headmaster's study high beneath the castle roof, past the weary stone gargoyle, and up the slow-moving spiral of the stair, into the room where the painted portraits of all the old headmasters and headmistresses had watched over the school's every sorrow for centuries. There, in a gilded frame behind the great desk, the likeness of Albus Dumbledore looked down upon the boy he had loved and guided, and, in his own complicated and secret way, prepared for everything, and the whole quiet wall of portraits rose to their feet in a long and wordless tribute. In that gentle high room, the painted Dumbledore wept softly with pride, and when Harry made known the choice that his heart had already settled, the old headmaster agreed that it was a wise one. For Harry had come, through so very much grief, to understand the deepest lesson that the 3 Deathly Hallows had to teach, which was that the true master of death is never the one who gathers such objects and clings to them, but rather the one who accepts that death must one day come and does not run from it. The resurrection stone he had already let fall somewhere among the roots and the dead leaves of the forbidden forest dropped from his fingers as he walked toward what he had believed would be his own end, and he had no intention at all of ever going back to search for it, and he hoped with his whole heart that no other soul would ever find it either. The cloak of invisibility, the third and gentlest of the Hallows, the one that had been handed quietly down through his own family from father to son across many long generations, that he would keep, for it was his by right and by love, and there was no harm in it. But the wand, the dangerous wand, he would give back. His plan was as simple as it was quiet. He would return the Elder Wand to the white marble tomb beside the Great Lake, where Albus Dumbledore had been laid to his rest, the very tomb that Voldemort had once so cruelly broken open to steal the wand away. He would lay it back where it had rested in its master's still hands, and then, if all went as he hoped, he would live out a long and ordinary life and die one day undefeated, an old man passing gently in the fullness of his years, having never lost a duel while the wand was truly his. And should that come to pass, then the wand's power would break at last, its long chain of conquest ending not in blood but in peace, and the most dangerous wand ever made would become, forever after, only a wand. So it was that the pale length of elder wood was carried back down to the sleeping grounds and laid once more in the cool dark of the tomb beside the water. And the white marble was closed gently over it, and the lake lay flat and still beneath the stars, and the wand that had cut a long red line through so many centuries of history was returned to its grave to trouble the world no more. Harry kept his own faithful holly wand and his father's soft gray cloak, and he asked for nothing else, and in that single, unshowy act of giving something back, he closed the last open door of the whole long war more surely than any trial or any statute ever could. And now 19 slow and gentle years began at last to turn, years of weddings and of children, of ordinary breakfasts and quiet autumn mornings, until one bright September day would carry the whole story forward into a crowded railway station, thick with steam and with farewells. Up next, in Chapter 16, A Platform in the Steam, we'll drift ahead across those 19 peaceful years to King's Cross Station and the Scarlet Hogwarts Express, where Harry and Ginny, Ron and Hermione stand upon the barrier at platform 9 3/4 to see a new generation off to school for the very first time. With the wand of destiny laid quietly back into the white tomb beside the wizard who had once wielded it, and with the 3 Hallows given up one by one, the last of them let go on purpose, in a wild and tangled forest, The long unwinding of the war was at last complete, and the years that followed asked nothing dramatic of the man who had ended it. They asked only that he live, and he did, slowly and gratefully and well, and the peace he had bought held firm around him season after season, so that the boy who had been marked in his cradle grew into a father without ever again feeling the old fire wake in his brow. 19 quiet autumns came and went in this way, each one a little softer than the last, until the calendar turned around once more to the first day of September, and a morning arrived that was crisp and golden as a ripe apple, the kind of morning that seemed to have been polished for the beginning of something gentle. On that shining morning, a family set out through the ordinary bustle of a great London railway station, threading between hurrying strangers who never guessed what walked among them, a father pushing a heavily laden trolley and a mother walking close beside him, and 3 children weaving in and out of the crowd. The 2 younger boys were much of an age, and there was a small skipping girl who was not yet old enough for what the others were about to begin, and she was cross about it in the sweet way of a child who longs to be older. They came at last to the solid stretch of brick wall that stood between platforms 9 and 10, a wall that looked to every passer-by like nothing at all, and one by one they leaned casually against it and slipped straight through, vanishing out of the humdrum world and into the hidden one that lay waiting behind it. Beyond the barrier the air was thick and white with billowing steam, and out of that soft cloud rose the great scarlet shape of the Hogwarts Express, its engine gleaming, its whistle waiting, its many doors flung open along a crowded platform full of trunks and owl cages and the ceaseless chatter of parting. Cats wound about the legs of their owners, and toads croaked from cupped hands, and the ghostly figures of families loomed and softened again in the drifting mist. It was the same train that had once carried a lonely, wondering boy toward the first true home he had ever known, and now it stood ready to carry his own children along the very same rails into the very same castle, and there was, in that steaming, ordinary scene, a quiet marvel that only a father who had feared for the future could fully feel. Into this warm confusion came another familiar pair, the red-haired man and the clever brown-haired woman who had walked beside him through every dark mile long ago, and with them their own 2 children, an older girl with a face full of mischief and a smaller boy trailing behind. The uncle was in a merry humor, boasting gently that he had at last passed his test to drive a Muggle motor car, though his wife rolled her eyes and reminded no one in particular that he had managed it only by muddling the examiner's mind with a charm. And because the children begged him for it, he made a small trick of magic that he had picked up from the joke shop, drawing his own nose clean off his face and holding it up between 2 fingers before setting it back again, so that the little ones shrieked with laughter, and the platform felt, for a moment, like the happiest place in all the world. Just then, the eldest boy came dashing back through the crowd with news too delicious to keep, for he had spied, further along the platform, the tall-grown godson of the family locked in a shy embrace with the lovely eldest daughter of the seaside cottage, the 2 of them lost in one another amid the steam. The boy reported this with enormous relish and no mercy at all, and the grown-ups only smiled, for they had long half expected it, and there was a tender rightness in the sight of that orphaned young man. Once the smallest and saddest child of the war, now old enough to be sweet on a girl born the very morning the fighting ended. Love had come round in a full and gentle circle, and the parents watching it felt the years fold softly over on themselves. But one of the 2 younger boys did not laugh, for a private worry sat heavy on him. and he confided it at last to his father in a small and anxious voice, afraid that when the great hat was placed upon his head that night, it would call out the name of the serpent house, the house of the enemies of old. Then the father knelt down until his eyes were level with the boy's, the one child of the three who had inherited the bright green eyes of the grandmother he had never met. And he spoke to him with all the calm that 19 safe years had given him. He reminded the boy that he had been named for 2 headmasters of that school, and that one of the 2 had been a son of the serpent house himself, and had been, in the father's certain judgment, quite the bravest man he had ever known. And he told him a thing the boy had never guessed, that the sorting hat weighs a heart's own wishes, that long ago it had listened to a frightened first year and honored his choice, and that if it truly mattered to the boy, the hat would listen to him just the same. A little way along the platform there stood another small family, apart and quiet, a pale man in a dark coat, buttoned to his throat, his gentle wife at his side, and their fair-haired son beside them with a trunk of his own, for this boy, too, was setting out for his first year that very day. The pale man caught the father's eye across the drifting steam, and after all the long and bitter history that lay between their 2 names, he gave only a single curt nod, a small, stiff courtesy that would once have been unthinkable, and then he turned away. The merry uncle, watching, could not resist teasing his own daughter that she must beat the fair-haired boy in every examination, and pretending in mock horror that she must never ever grow too fond of him, though it was all in fun, and the mother scolded him for planting mischief between children who had not yet even met. Then the great whistle blew, long and echoing, and the last farewells came quick and warm, kisses pressed to foreheads and promises to write, and trunks heaved up through the open doors. The children climbed aboard, and the doors slammed all along the scarlet flank of the train, and faces crowded to the lowered windows. Slowly, with a great sigh of steam, the engine began to move, and the fathers and mothers walked along the platform keeping pace with it, waving and smiling even as their hearts pulled after their departing sons and daughters. The anxious boy with the green eyes leaned from his window, his thin face already lit with a helpless, dawning excitement, despite all his fear, and the train gathered speed and swept him away around the long bend of the track, out of sight and off toward the north, and the platform grew quiet again beneath its settling clouds of white. Up next in Chapter 17, Albus and Scorpius and a New Sorting, we'll follow that green-eyed boy down the swaying corridor of the moving train and watch how a lonely search for an empty seat carried him at last to the side of the fair-haired son of an old enemy, and how a friendship no one had planned for began softly to take root as the castle drew near and the great hat waited. And so, while the steam of the scarlet engine drifted along the crowded platform and folded the families of the piece into its soft gray warmth, there stood within it one small dark-haired boy who could not, for all his quiet trying, keep the fear from his heart. His name was Albus Severus Potter, the second son of Harry and Ginny, and he was 11 years old upon that bright September morning, and he was leaving for Hogwarts for the very first time, and the thing that troubled him was a worry he had scarcely dared to speak aloud. It was the dread that when at last he sat upon the 3-legged stool in the great hall, and the ancient sorting hat was lowered over his eyes, it would call out the name of Slytherin, the house of the serpent, and that he would become the first in all the long and gentle line of Potters ever to be placed there. His elder brother James, already a Gryffindor, and already full of the easy, cheerful teasing of older brothers everywhere, had needled him without mercy upon exactly this point, and the small hook of it had sunk in deep, so that Albus carried the worry with him through the barrier and out onto the platform and into the very heart of the steam. But his father knelt beside him there amid the smoke and the noise and the last hurried farewells. And Harry, who knew better than almost any living soul what it was to be afraid of that particular house, gave his son the words that would come to matter more than anything else across the whole strange year ahead. He told the boy that he had been named for 2 of the headmasters of Hogwarts, and that one of those 2, Severus Snape, had been a Slytherin and had very likely been the bravest man that Harry had ever known in all his life. And he told him, gently, that if it should truly come to matter to him, the Sorting Hat would take his own choosing into account, for it had done exactly that for Harry himself long years before, when a frightened boy upon that same worn stool had only to wish quietly that he might not be given to the serpent, and the hat had heard the wish, and had set him among the lions instead. Then the great whistle sounded down the length of the train, and the children climbed aboard, and the scarlet engine drew slowly away from the waving parents and carried the new generation north toward the mountains. Upon the train, Albus went walking down the swaying corridor in search of a compartment, and with him went his cousin Rose, the bright and clever daughter of Ron and Hermione, who was very nearly his own age and had been his companion through the whole of their shared childhood. Rose was eager to find the right sort of friends and to begin school upon exactly the right footing. But Albus, quieter and more uncertain, cared far less for such things, and it was he who slid open the door of a compartment that everyone else upon the train seemed carefully to have passed by. Within it sat a single pale boy, quite alone. A shy and bookish boy surrounded by a great heap of sweets he had bought from the trolley to comfort himself. And this lonely boy was Scorpius Hyperion Malfoy, the only child of Draco Malfoy and Astoria Greengrass, the gentlest natured child, as it would turn out, of his whole generation. Now a cruel and baseless rumor had been whispered about this quiet boy long before ever he set foot upon the train, and it followed him like a cold shadow he had done nothing to earn. It was said, in hushed and wicked voices, that Scorpius was not truly the son of Draco at all, but the son of Lord Voldemort himself, for the tale went that Draco and Astoria had longed so desperately for a child, and had feared so greatly that they could not have one, that they had turned back the very wheel of time with a hidden time-turner and sent Astoria into the past to conceive a child by the Dark Lord, so that his terrible bloodline might live on. It was a monstrous and untrue thing, invented out of nothing but old malice, and yet it clung to the gentle boy wherever he went. Rose had heard the rumor, as everyone had, and it made her cold and wary, and after only a few uneasy moments she drew back from the compartment and went away to seek out other company. But Albus did not follow her. He stayed, and he sat down among the sweets, and he began to talk with the lonely boy that all the world had shunned, and in that small and ordinary act, across the very oldest and deepest of all the family divides, the son of Harry Potter and the son of Draco Malfoy became, from that hour onward, the truest and dearest friends that either of them would ever know. Then, the train arrived beneath the dark mountains, and the first years were carried across the Black Lake in their little boats to the lit castle upon the far shore, and they were led into the great hall for the sorting. One after another the children were called forward, and the old hat sang and pondered and chose, and Rose was set among the Gryffindors as all her family had been before her. But when Scorpius Malfoy came forward, the hat scarcely paused before it named him a Slytherin, as everyone had expected of a Malfoy. And when at last the name of Albus Potter was called and the frightened boy sat down upon the stool, the whole hall grew still and watchful. The hat sat a long moment upon his head, and then, into the waiting silence, it called out the one word that Albus had dreaded above all others, and it named him a Slytherin too. So the son of the great Harry Potter was placed in the House of the Serpent, apart from all his family, and yet placed there beside the one friend in all the school who truly understood him, and the two lonely boys who had found one another upon the train now found themselves seated together at the same green-draped table beneath the same silver banner. The years that followed were not easy years for Albus Potter. He proved a clumsy and unhappy pupil, poor at his spellwork and hopeless upon a broomstick, so that in the flying lessons he could not so much as lift the thing into his hand, while his cousin Rose soared easily above him, and there were unkind children who took to calling him the Slytherin squib behind his back. Season upon season the Scarlet Engine bore him north again, through his first year, and his second, and his third, and into his fourth. And with every returning autumn, the distance between the boy and his famous father seemed to widen a little further, for Harry did not know how to reach the unhappy son who so wished to be left alone. And Albus did not know how to forgive the father whose enormous shadow he felt he could never hope to fill. Only Scorpius stayed close through all of it, faithful and kind and steady, sharing the sweets and the homework and the long, slow loneliness, until the two of them together made an island of quiet friendship in a school that did not quite know what to do with either one of them. And it was into this deepening sadness, this widening silence between a boy and his father, that there would soon come whispers of an old and dangerous device, a small golden hourglass that could turn back the wheel of the years, and a chance, or so it would seem, to reach into the past and set a single terrible sorrow right. Up next in Chapter 18, the Time Turner and the Rewritten Years will follow Albus and Scorpius as they overhear the tale of a last surviving Time Turner and of a boy lost long ago at the Triwizard Tournament, and set out in secret to unmake an old grief, never dreaming how cruelly the rewritten years would twist the whole world out of its true and gentle shape. For a long while it had seemed to Albus Severus Potter that the whole of his life would be lived in the shadow of a name far too large for him to carry, and that no matter how faithful the friendship of Scorpius Malfoy might be, he would remain forever the disappointing son of the most famous wizard in all the world. The years at Hogwarts had passed slowly and unhappily for him, term after gray term in the green and silver of Slytherin, and between the boy and his father there had grown a quiet coolness, a distance stitched together of small wounds and clumsier words, until it seemed that Harry Potter, who had come in his long life to understand so very much, could not for all his gentle trying understand this one unhappy child of his own. And it was into that long unhappiness, in the 40th year of Harry's life, that there came one gray autumn evening an old and broken man in a wheelchair, and with him a strange, dark-haired young woman, carrying between them a temptation that would very nearly unmake the world. The old man was Amos Diggory, the father of Cedric, that bright and gentle boy who had been murdered so many years before in the graveyard at Little Hangleton, upon the terrible night when Lord Voldemort clawed his way back into a body. Amos had grown ancient now, and bent, and bitter with a grief that the long peace had never once eased, and he lived out his last days in a home for aged witches and wizards called St. Oswald's, tended there by his niece, a soft-spoken young woman named Delphine, whom all who knew her called Delphi. Amos had caught the thread of a whispered rumor, and he had come to Harry's own doorstep to speak it aloud, that the Ministry of Magic had quietly seized and hidden away an unlawful time turner, a device far stronger than any of the little hourglasses that had been shattered long ago in the Department of Mysteries. And he begged Harry to use it, to reach back across all the years and pluck his murdered son from death. But Harry, who knew better than almost any living soul what ruin came of meddling with the flow of time, refused him gently, and then refused him firmly, and the old man was wheeled wounded away into the night. Yet Albus had heard every word of it from the dim turning of the stairs, and the raw old grief of Amos Diggory spoke straight into the aching, disappointed heart of the boy, who longed above all things to do one great and worthy deed that his own father had declared could not be done. And so, with the soft encouragement of Delphi, who seemed to the two lonely boys the first grown person in all the world to believe in them, Albus and Scorpius resolved upon a secret and a reckless thing. They would steal away the hidden time turner, and they would journey back through the buried years, and they would save Cedric Diggory from his death, and so set right a wrong that had haunted them both like an old and patient ghost. They slipped from the Hogwarts Express as it thundered northward, climbing at last to its very roof, where the ancient trolley witch who had guarded that scarlet train for more than 190 years revealed herself as a fearsome keeper of her passengers before the boys leapt free into the rushing dark. They made their careful way to Delphi, and the three of them laid their plan, and then, upon a stolen measure of polyjuice potion, they walked boldly into the Ministry of Magic itself. Albus wore the borrowed face of his Uncle Ron, and Scorpius wore the very face of Harry Potter, and Delphi wore the shape of Hermione Granger, who was now the Minister for Magic herself. In Hermione's own guarded office they found the time turner concealed behind a whispering, riddling bookcase, and they answered its dark words, and they took the small golden thing into their trembling hands. This time turner was a strange and a cruel prototype, for it granted its user only 5 short minutes in the past before it snatched him home again. With it, the three of them fell backward across more than 2 decades to the first task of the long-ago Triwizard Tournament, and there, disguised as students of Durmstrang, they worked to shame young Cedric and turn him from his path, casting the disarming charm upon him so that his wand flew from his hand before the whole watching crowd. Then time snapped them forward again. But the world they returned to was not the world they had left. Albus found himself sorted now into Gryffindor, and colder than ever toward his father. Ron Weasley had married Padma Patil in place of Hermione, and Hermione herself had become a hard and lonely teacher of defense against the dark arts, wedded to no one at all, and the bright girl named Rose, who ought to have been born to Ron and Hermione, had never come into the world. The smallest of changes had rippled outward into 1,000 quiet losses, and the two boys understood with a slow dawning horror what dreadful power lay sleeping in the little hourglass they held. They resolved to mend it, and so they fell back through time once more, this time to the second task of that same tournament at the edge of the wide black lake, meaning only to humble Cedric a little more gently. But the journey went badly wrong. They were seen, and in the struggle Albus was hurt, and when the 5 minutes ended it was Scorpius alone, who was flung forward into the present, into a world more terrible than any nightmare. For in shaming Cedric so deeply, they had turned that gentle boy bitter, and the bitter Cedric had grown into a Death Eater and had slain brave Neville Longbottom upon the field of the last battle, so that the great snake Nagini was never killed, and Voldemort had won, and Harry Potter lay long years dead, and Albus had never been born at all. Scorpius wandered alone through that darkened world, where the wizards kept a grim holiday they called Voldemort Day, and Dolores Umbridge ruled as headmistress over a cruel and joyless Hogwarts, and Scorpius himself was feared throughout the school as the favored Scorpion King. Yet even there, deep in the shadows, the resistance still flickered, for Severus Snape yet lived, laboring in secret alongside the fugitives Ron and Hermione to keep alight the memory of a better and a gentler world. It was Snape, conjuring the silver doe of his Patronus one last time, who understood at last that he must give up his own life so that the boy might undo all that had been broken, and he turned to face the swarming Dementors so that Scorpius could slip away unseen. And Scorpius fell back through time a final desperate stretch to the second task once again, and there he stopped his own past self from harming Cedric and let the true course of the years flow onward unbroken, and so restored the whole gentle world that had so very nearly been lost forever. When at last the golden hourglass carried him home, Albus was waiting for him, alive and whole, in the world as it had always been meant to be, and the two shaken boys swore to one another to be finished forever with the stealing of time. And yet, for all their weariness and all their relief, they did not yet know the truth of the quiet young woman who had smiled so kindly upon their reckless plan, nor whose child she truly was, nor what ancient and patient darkness had waited 19 long years in the shadows to be born anew. Up next, in Chapter 19, The Shadow of a Hidden Heir, we'll uncover the terrible secret of Delphi Diggory, who was no Diggory at all, but the hidden heir of Lord Voldemort himself, born in secret to Bellatrix Lestrange in the last dark days before the fall. And we'll follow her last desperate flight back through time toward the night where everything had once begun, in the quiet little village of Godric's Hollow. When the two boys had at last unwound all the rewritten years and had set the trembling world gently back upon the road it was always meant to travel, they believed, as weary travelers so often do once the long danger seems past, that the worst was safely behind them, and that nothing remained but to go quietly home and be forgiven. Yet there was one shadow they had not accounted for, one silent figure who had walked beside them through the whole of their wandering and had never once shown her true face, and it was in the slow unmasking of that figure that the last and strangest turning of the 19 years would come to pass. Her name, the name she had given them, was Delphi, and she had come to them first as the kind and clever niece of poor old Amos Diggory, a caretaker in the quiet halls of St. Oswald's home for old witches and wizards, where the very oldest of the wizarding world sat dozing out their final years. She had seemed to the boys the one grown soul who truly understood them, and they had followed her trustingly back into the past, never once suspecting the terrible thing that lay coiled beneath her easy warmth. For Delphi was not the niece of Amos Diggory at all, and she never had been. She was, in the deepest of secrets, the only child that the Dark Lord had ever fathered, born in the shadowed rooms of Malfoy Manor in the last black days before the final battle, the daughter of Lord Voldemort himself, and of his most devoted and most dangerous follower, the witch Bellatrix Lestrange. Delphine was her full and hidden name, and she had been carried away as an infant and raised among the faithful who still kept the old dark creed alive, growing up in secret with a single burning purpose folded into her heart, which was to undo the defeat of the father she had never known. Upon her back she bore the mark of the Augure, the mournful dark bird whose cry was once believed to foretell a coming death, and she carried with her a prophecy, whispered and only half believed, which told that when the spare was spared, and when time was turned, and when unseen children murdered their fathers, then would the Dark Lord return at last to the world. It had been for the sake of that whispered prophecy that she had first set the boys upon their errand of turning back the years to save the gentle boy called Cedric, the spare whom Voldemort had once ordered killed without a thought, and when all that meddling with time had failed to raise her father from the dead, she cast aside at last the soft mask she had worn so long. In a cold moment within the very walls of Hogwarts, she showed the boys the full measure of what she truly was, and a young student named Craig, who had done nothing in all his life but stumble unknowing into her path, was struck down by her without mercy and without pause, so that the boys understood, far too late, the depth of the danger they had befriended. Then she gathered up Albus and Scorpius, whether they willed it or no, and turned the golden time-turner in her hand and carried them back across the long, dark reach of the years to the very place where all of history had once so nearly ended. She brought them to the small village of Godric's Hollow, upon the eve of the night that had changed the whole of the world, the 31st of October, in the year 1981, when a young and terrible Voldemort still walked the earth and drew ever nearer to the little house where the Potters slept. For this was the cold heart of her design, simple and dreadful. She meant to stand between her father and his ruin, to stop him before he ever raised his wand against the baby who would one day become his undoing, so that the curse would never rebound, and the Dark Lord would never fall, and all of history from that night onward would be quietly and forever unmade. And having no further use for the two boys, she abandoned them there, stranded in that long-ago autumn, adrift in a year long before their own lives had ever begun, with no way home and no living soul who knew where or when they had been lost. Yet the boys were not wholly without hope, for Scorpius remembered that far ahead down all the years, in their own gentle time, Harry Potter still kept and treasured a small worn baby blanket, the one poor relic that remained to him of the mother he had lost upon that very night. And it came to them that a message written into such a blanket in the deep past might, if they were only patient and careful enough, still lie waiting to be read when at last it came into his hands. So with a little demi-guise and a little love potion, they wrote their secret plea into the very weave of the cloth, a message that would rest hidden and faithful across all the long decades, and would rise slowly into sight only when the one who loved them came near, telling him where they were and when, and begging him with all their hearts to come. And in the calm of the present day, in a house grown very quiet with worry, Harry Potter felt an old and long silent pain wake once more in the lightning-shaped scar upon his brow, a burning that told him, as it had told him in his boyhood, that the Dark Lord was somehow near again. And turning to the little blanket he had kept so long, he watched the boy's faint words rise slowly through the cloth. Then Harry and Ginny, and Ron and Hermione, and Draco Malfoy also, whose own beloved son was lost among the years, gathered together their old and tested courage one final time. From his careful keeping, Draco brought out a second time-turner, a truer and more perfect one than any the Ministry had ever owned, which could carry its travelers deep into the past and hold them there for as long as they had need. And with it the five of them turned the years and followed the children down into the dark of 1981. There, in the shadows of Godric's Hollow, upon the last evening of the Potters' lives, a strange and desperate plan was quietly laid. Harry, who had spent the whole of his life beneath the shadow of the man who had killed his mother and father, agreed to become that man's very likeness for one final hour. And by careful transfiguration he was shaped into the image of Lord Voldemort himself, so that he might walk out to meet the waiting Delphi, wearing the face of the father she had never seen. For a single breath she was deceived, and in that breath the trap was sprung, and a fierce and frightened struggle broke out beneath the cold autumn sky, until at the last, ringed about by Harry and his family, and by the two boys she had betrayed, the hidden heir of Voldemort was overcome and bound, and her long dream of raising the dead broke gently apart within her hands. But there remained one sorrow that even all their victory could not spare them. For the true Voldemort was even then drawing near to that little house, and if the world was to go on being the world they knew and loved, then nothing at all must be done to turn him aside. And so Harry Potter, who had crossed the whole breadth of time to reach that place, was made to do the very hardest thing that had ever been asked of any man. He gathered his family close about him in the darkness, and he stood, and he watched, and he did not lift a hand to stop it, as his own young mother and father gave up their lives within those walls to shield a child too small to understand, and he heard once more, across all the silent years, the last loving words of the mother he had never truly known, and he let her go, so that the whole of the world might live. It was a grief past the gentle telling of it, and yet it was also, in its terrible and tender way, a kind of farewell he had never once been granted, a single chance to stand near his parents in his groan, and knowing years before he let them slip away. When it was done at last, they turned the long years forward once again and carried Delphi home into their own quiet time, where the daughter of the Dark Lord was given, in the end, not to death, but to the cold and lonely keeping of Azkaban, there to live out her days far apart from the world she had tried so hard to unmake. And the two boys, who had wandered so terribly far and come so near to being lost forever, were carried home again into the arms of the fathers who had crossed all of time to find them, so that the shadow of the hidden heir passed away at last, and left the calmer world unbroken behind it. Up next in Chapter 20, All Was Well, we'll follow Harry and his son Albus up the long green hill to a quiet grave, and listen as a father and a son, so long divided, find at the very last the gentle words that set 19 years of shadow softly and forever to rest. And even that last shadow, the strangest and most secret of them all, the hidden child of the darkness who had waited so long in the folds of the years, passed away in the end as every shadow before it had passed, quietly and wholly, until nothing was left of it but the calm it had troubled and could not keep. For the girl who called herself Delphine, the daughter that Lord Voldemort had never known he had fathered, the heir got in secret upon Bellatrix Lestrange in the final days of the war, and hidden away, and raised alone upon a single desperate hope, had reached back at last with all her borrowed and stolen power into the oldest and darkest night of the whole long tale. She had gone back across the better part of 40 years to the small, quiet village of Godric's Hollow, to the very last evening of October, in the year 1981, meaning to stand beside her father before his fall, and to whisper him gently away from the one small mistake upon which every good thing that ever came afterward had silently and secretly depended. And she had not gone alone, for she had carried back with her, against their will and beyond their power to return, the two boys who had blundered so far out of their depth, Albus Potter and Scorpius Malfoy, the shy and gentle sons of two old enemies, who now found themselves stranded together in a year long before their own births, in the cold October dark of a village they knew only from sorrowful stories. Yet even there, lost and frightened and small, the two of them did the one wise and quiet thing that was left to them to do. Knowing that somewhere far across all the years their families would surely be searching, they contrived to send a single message forward through time, hidden in the folds of the very blanket in which the infant Harry had once been wrapped, the one small relic of his lost mother that he had carried and kept and loved through the whole of his life, so that the words might sleep in its threads for 19 long years and wake at last in the hands of the grown man who needed them. And in the present the message was found, and it was understood, and the family that had faced down every darkness rose once more to face this final one. Harry and Ginny, and Ron and Hermione, and Draco Malfoy, who had kept in secret all these years a true and working time-turner, wound themselves back together across the decades and stepped out into the night of Godric's Hollow, into the very hour before the hour that had made Harry what he was. There, by a strange and sorrowful cunning, Harry allowed himself to be transfigured into the shape of the enemy he had long ago destroyed, into the pale and terrible likeness of Lord Voldemort himself, and wearing that dreadful borrowed face, he drew the lonely, desperate girl out of the shadows and into the open, where at last, gently and firmly and all together, they took the fight from her and bound her and made her harmless. And she who had wanted nothing in all the wide world but a father wept in the ruin of her one hope, and was led quietly away. Yet the hardest thing of that whole long night was not the binding of Delphine, for there remained a sorrow far deeper and far more cruel. Harry understood, standing in the dark of that familiar and unbearable street, that he had come to the one night he could never mend. That the small cottage glowing softly at the end of the lane held his mother and his father alive and unknowing in their last quiet hour, and that if he saved them, if he reached out his hand to keep them living, he would unweave the whole of the world that their deaths had bought. And so Harry Potter did the bravest and most terrible thing that was ever asked of him. He stood back in the shadows with Ginny's hand in his, and he let it happen. He watched the pale figure come up the garden path, and he heard the door give way, and he watched through the window as his father fell to keep them safe, and his mother fell to keep her son alive. And he did not move, and he did not cry out, and he let the great and holy sacrifice of their love complete itself exactly as it had always been, so that the child upstairs might live, and the war might one distant day be ended, and every single soul who came gently after might come. Then it was over, and the curse rebounded as it had always rebounded, and the old darkness fell as it had always fallen, and the family gathered up the weeping girl and turned time forward once more and came home. Delphine, the last shadow of the last war, was given not to death but to the long gray keeping of Azkaban, and with her passing out of the free world, the very final thread of Voldemort's long shadow was drawn quietly to its close, so that there was nothing left of him anywhere upon the earth, not an heir, not a Horcrux, not a hope, nothing at all but the deep peace that had outlasted him. And out of that terrible and healing night there came, most gently of all, the mending of a much smaller and much nearer sorrow, for the long cold distance that had grown between Harry and his middle son melted quite away. Albus Severus, who had feared so badly that he could never be worthy of the great and heavy name he carried, and Harry, who had never quite known how to speak to the child who reminded him so painfully of himself, found each other at last across all that had frightened them, and understood and forgave. And in the quiet days that followed, Harry took his son to stand upon a green and windy hillside before the grave of Cedric Diggory, the brave boy whose death had begun the whole grief of Harry's own youth, and had begun this strange late adventure too. And there, in the calm presence of that old loss, the father and the son laid down the last of the fear between them, and were simply, and gladly, a father and a son once more. So the very last shadow passed away, and the calmer world closed softly over it, and the years took up again their slow and gentle turning. Scorpius Malfoy kept the dearest friend that a once lonely boy could ever wish for, and carried in his shy heart a small warm hope of Rose Granger Weasley that he was in no hurry at all to speak aloud. The great Red Clan gathered still at the crooked and beloved burrow, and Hermione governed wisely from the ministry, and Ron laughed in his shop of jokes, and Ginny watched over her 3 children with fierce and tender eyes, and George kept the counters full, and Neville tended his plants, and Luna wandered happily after her soft strange wonders, and Teddy grew tall and kind, and all of them, every single one, lived on beneath a wide sky that no darkness would ever cloud again. And Harry Potter, the boy who had lived, and the man who had let his own parents go to keep the world whole, went home at the last to his quiet house and his sleeping children, and the warm, ordinary evening of a life he had never once dared to imagine he would be given. His scar had not pained him in 19 years. Nothing hunted him now, and nothing waited for him in the dark, and all the long roll of the fallen rested easy at last, their sacrifice kept safe forever in the simple daily happiness of the living. The story had come, by its own slow and faithful road, all the way home to peace. There was nothing more to fear, and nothing more to mend, and nothing left to do but rest. All was well. All, at the very last, and forever after, was well. And so we come, softly, to the end of the story. Tonight we followed the morning after the battle, the 50 laid in a row and the castle in ruins, the trials and who walked free, the long rebuilding of Hogwarts stone by stone, and the slow cleaning of the ministry. We watched the blood laws pulled from the books, one clause at a time, Harry and Ron in the Auror Office, Hermione's long climb to minister for magic, George in a shop with one twin in it, and the quiet lives of Neville and Luna. We saw the weddings and the new peace, Teddy Lupin raised by many hands, the children of a calmer world, Creature and the mending of an old wrong, and the wand returned at last to its grave. And then a platform full of steam, and a new sorting for Albus and Scorpius, a turner of time and the years it almost rewrote, the shadow of a hidden heir, and the calm that settled once again when all of it was over, and all was well. There is nothing left now that you must remember. Let each of those quiet, hard-won things sink away from you, down through still dark water, growing fainter and fainter until only calm remains. You are safe. You are whole. Nothing here is broken, and nothing asks anything of you. Let your breathing slow, and let the last of the day dissolve like mist over a quiet lake. Good night. If this story carried you toward rest, stay with us and let a gentle subscribe keep them coming. There are many more long, slow tales waiting for the nights ahead.